Chapter 157. After this incident, there was no way for them to continue their journey. Moreover, the young magicians were all in low spirit. In their eyes, this experience was just a vacation. They would hire a mercenary who knew the Hydra's lair as a guide, find the Hydra, and attack it together. If they couldn't defeat the Hydra, their dean would naturally help them. Finally, they would kill the Hydra and return to isolated Cliff City with a magic transmission scroll. Everything was as simple as that. Every step in their imagination contained a lot of details. If there was an accident in every detail, it would be dangerous or even disastrous. The so-called maturity didn't mean that they could accurately predict what was going to happen, but that when an accident happened, they could immediately determine how to solve the crisis. At times like this, there was no time to think carefully. They could only rely on their instincts. Unfortunately, instincts couldn't be learned by learning. They had to go through the tempering of life and death. Moxink found a sandy area in the upper reaches of the spring and spent a lot of effort to build 2 very simple tents made of twigs, which could barely accommodate a few people. The girls could sleep in the tents today, but the men had to sleep in the open. Fortunately, it was summer now, and the heat would pass after a while. That night, no one could sleep well. Han Jin and the others didn't have any psychological problems at all. The key was the magicians. In comparison, the female magicians were the most unbearable. They tossed and turned until late at night and finally fell asleep, only to be woken up by nightmares. Han Jin realized for the first time that people who had nightmares could scream so horribly. The heart-wrenching screams and the sorrowful cries that sounded like the cries of a 1,000-year-old ghost could give people goosebumps. Normally, after being woken up a few times, people would just ignore everything and go back to sleep, but Han Jin and the others couldn't. There were all kinds of hidden dangers in the forest, and they couldn't relax their vigilance for any reason. Although they had no choice, they still had to check the surroundings every time they were woken up. It was daybreak, and no matter how they rested for the night, they had to continue their journey. The earlier they completed the mission, the earlier they could go home. Including Han Jin and the others, no one wanted to stay in the magical beast forest for too long. Morrison's was still in charge of leading the way, and Leger was no longer slacking off like he was yesterday. He and Sunir were on the left and right sides of the team, while Han Jin and Sasu were in charge of bringing up the rear. Although they didn't say it out loud, they had already reached a tacit understanding. The sorcerers looked quite pitiful, so they should help them as much as possible. Of course, it was only a kind of help. Everyone had their own selfish motives. How much one gave depended on how much the other party was willing to give. If he was in danger, would the other party risk his life to save him? If not, then why should he sacrifice himself? Trust wasn't something that could be gained easily. Han Jin and the others had been together for the past year, and they had gone through all kinds of difficulties to build a solid foundation for their friendship. This was more than a year, and how many years could a person live? They had only interacted with the sorcerers for 2 days, and there was no trust or affection to speak of. However, a dramatic scene appeared. Flash Leopard. Retreat! Morrison's University roared. In the moment he turned his head to shout and turned his head back, the Flash Leopard had already fallen into a pool of blood. Then, Morrison's felt a strong wave of magic. Killer bees! It's killer bees! Everyone! Morrison's was only halfway through his shout when a dazzling ball of fire appeared, enveloping the fog-like swarm of bees, the 4-meter-tall hive, and a dozen ancient trees. When the fire disappeared, everything within a few dozen meters had turned into ashes. Nothing was left. Giant eagle! Be careful, it's treating us as food. A bolt of lightning fell, and the giant eagle, which made Morrison's nervous, was cut in half by the lightning. The 2 halves rolled among the leaves and fell to the ground. After repeating this several times, Morrison's felt very embarrassed. There was a top-grade magus in the team. What was the point of him yelling and jumping up and down? Wasn't he just like a clown? Genius Magus Yelena's attitude had undergone a drastic change. In the past, she was like an iceberg, quietly following the team because her responsibility was to supervise and protect. She believed that she should only intervene when the situation was extremely bad. Now, she had become a taut bow. As long as she saw something threatening, she would attack first, not giving the students a chance to practice. What was even more hilarious was that when they encountered two other mercenary teams, Yelena would immediately release a magic barrier to protect everyone in the team. In such a tense situation, she did not forget to protect others, which was worthy of praise. However, she then prepared to release offensive magic. One of the mercenary teams sensed the violent magic waves that were enough to change the color of the sky and was scared witless. They thought that they had encountered a mercenary team that specialized in killing others, so they immediately scattered and fled into the depths of the forest. The other mercenary team was not easy to deal with. They immediately prepared for battle. The thieves went invisible, the archers sneaked into the forest, the magicians released their shields, and the warriors released their combat power. Morrison's jumped in the middle and waved his hand desperately to stop Yelena's impulse. After that, Morrison's threw down his giant sword to show that he was a peacemaker. He then walked towards the mercenary team and sincerely apologized. He explained that they were a newly formed mercenary team that was attacked by another mercenary team in the forest a few days ago. Therefore, they were still a bit emotional. The leader of the mercenary team was a reasonable person. After hearing about Morrison's experience, he expressed deep sympathy. Then, the two of them had a heated conversation. They deeply criticized some of the bad practices among mercenaries and condemned the inaction of the Mercenary Association. After exchanging names, Morrison's learned that the mercenary team in front of him was the Reaper mercenary team. Whether it was strength, income, or fame, the Reaper mercenary team was above the Red Vanguard. They were definitely in the top 3 of all the mercenary teams in isolated Cliff City. If they met in the forest under normal circumstances, the other party would not even bother to talk to Morrison's. However, because of Yelena's extraordinary strength, Morrison's, who used her power to intimidate others, received a lot of respect. The other party even left their address and asked Morrison's to have a few drinks with them when he returned. In the end, the two parties waved goodbye in a warm and friendly atmosphere. Morrison's, who had returned happily, saw Yelena, and his facial muscles could not help but twitch. Danger! If Yelena released her magic, it would be a fight to the death. Maybe Yelena could save her own life, but what about the others? How could they escape the Reaper mercenary team's pursuit? For 10 whole days they had been wandering in the forest. Except for this incident, there was nothing special. As for how many magic beasts they had encountered with Yelena around, everything seemed so ordinary. She could turn them into ashes with a wave of her hand. That was all. However, they had to admit that they had gained a lot because it was written in the contract that all the gains would be divided equally between the two parties. Yelena's strength was, of course, much stronger than the armored bulls they had used before. In addition, they were in the Terrashaw Mountains, so the magic crystals they gained every day were much more than before. Because of this, Han Jin and the others began to suspect that Leger was doing this on purpose. Han Jin and Morrison's also seriously found an opportunity to ask Leger out for a long talk. In the end, Leger swore that he had no intention of using those magicians. Indeed, they could not find anything that matched their impression of him. On this day, the road became more and more difficult to walk. Moxink's forehead was covered with a layer of fine sweat. It was easy to chop off the branches blocking the road, but the thick rattans that could be seen everywhere could not be cut off without more strength. Wait a minute. Something is wrong. Sunir suddenly jumped down from the tree. What's wrong? Han Jin went up to her. Didn't you notice? There are fewer and fewer low-level magic beasts. I suspect that there is a big guy nearby. As Sunir spoke, a pair of pointed ears stuck out from her long blonde hair moved a few times to capture the sounds around her. Yelena paused for a moment and nodded. That's right. How could there be other low-level magic beasts near the Hydra's nest? Who did you hear this from? Morrison's asked. His question was worth discussing because he was not asking how she knew. Obviously, he was sure that the genius magician in front of him could not have had any complicated experience. Do I need to hear this from others? Just think about it. Han Jin and the others looked at Leger. They had never dealt with the Hydra before, so they did not know its habits or the situation near its nest. However, they knew that nothing could be understood just by thinking about it. We're here? Asa and the others were all excited and quickly caught up with them. Yes, it shouldn't be far. Be careful, Yelena said softly. The young magicians were very excited and said, Don't worry, we'll be fine. Thank you for your concern. Morrison secretly curled his lips. If it weren't for Yelena, these students would not even be enough to fill the gaps between the Hydra's teeth. Leja was the most puzzled. He clearly remembered that there were all kinds of magical beasts in the Hydra lair the last time they found it. The only one they didn't find was a super-ranked magical beast like the Hydra. But judging from their conversation, could there really be a big guy here? However, even though he was puzzled, he still had to walk. Under Sunir's instructions, Morrison slowed down a lot. He was even ready to run to Han Jin as soon as he sensed anything strange. Just as everyone was moving forward cautiously, a giant eagle flew through the air. But just as the giant eagle flew over them, a low roar suddenly came from the depths of the forest. The giant eagle seemed to have hit an invisible wall, and it was instantly uprooted. It let out a panicked cry as it flew into the distance. Following the roar, everyone felt as if a sledgehammer had hit their chests. Han Jin and the others were fine, but the female magicians in the team were already pale and seemed to be unable to stand properly. Just the sound alone was so terrifying. How powerful was the magic beast? The genius sorceress exclaimed in surprise, and her expression became serious. Chapter 158. Han Jin and the others looked at each other. Before they could decide whether they should go or not, the ground suddenly shook. Then, crazy roars, muffled crashing sounds, and violent magic waves came from afar. The trees around them were all shaken to the point of rustling. What's going on over there? Asa asked in surprise. Don't wander off. Leger's figure flashed and disappeared into the dense forest. Don't bother. Yelena frowned and released her clairvoyant's eyes. The first two clairvoyant's eyes were not in the right position. When the third clairvoyant's eyes was released, a shocking scene appeared in front of everyone. Two holy beasts were engaged in a life-and-death battle. Those who had never seen them would not be able to imagine how huge they were. For example, Sunir had to jump between the branches several times before she could reach the top of the ancient tree, but the two holy beasts could reach the same height as the ancient tree if they stretched their necks. The two magical beasts both had fat bellies. Their lower bodies were similar to lizards, but their upper bodies were very different. One of them had several heads and a very long neck, even longer than its body. It moved abnormally fast, just like a spirit snake. Its whole body was greenish-gray and emitted a faint phosphorescent light. The other holy beast's body was a size smaller, of course, only compared to its opponent. However, its head was much larger than its opponent's, but unfortunately, it only had one head. In the crazy collisions and biting, it was obviously at a disadvantage. Whenever it was in danger, it would spit out a thick flame from its mouth to save itself from danger. Although they were far away from the battlefield, they could still feel the fierceness of the battle and the strength of the two holy animals. No matter if it was hard rocks or tall trees, nothing could withstand their tussle. Sand and stones were flying everywhere, and branches and leaves were falling down. It had only been a short time since the battle started, but the two holy animals had already razed the surrounding dozens of meters to the ground. In the battle, the holy beast with several heads could easily take the initiative, but it was very afraid of the flames released by its opponent. As soon as the flames flashed, it would retreat in panic. Sometimes, it could not retreat in time and was hit by the flames. It could be clearly seen that all its heads were trembling violently, and some were even twisted into a ball. Obviously, it was in great pain. Hydra? A dragon? Moxink's eyes almost popped out of his eye socket. It's not a dragon, it's a half-grown baby dragon, Yelena said softly. How pitiful! The young magicians were in an uproar and almost applauded. For them, these days were like hell. Now that they saw the Hydra, they could finally go home. As for whether they can kill Hydra, they are not worried at all. Morrisons and the others looked at each other. They could see the joy in each other's eyes. After all the loot would be divided equally. The key was that dragon. Although it was only a young dragon, its skin could be used to create top-tier armor. Its blood was an extremely rare alchemy ingredient. Its bones could be used to create a large number of magic arrows. If they met a good customer, such as an undead mage, a complete set of dragon bones could be sold for an astronomical price. Most importantly, they might even be able to obtain a dragon crystal. Realistically speaking, if they could obtain that dragon, they would not need to do anything else for the rest of their lives. It would be enough for them to live happily ever after. I've only heard of people who encountered such things and suddenly became rich. I didn't expect such good luck to come to us today. Morrison's laughed. Principal, shall we go now? Asa rubbed his hands excitedly. No, now is not the time, Sunir said. The battle between the two magical beasts became more and more intense. They wrestled from the hillside to the foot of the hill, and then from the foot of the hill to the next. Everywhere they went, there was a mess. In fact, hydras were very low ranked among the top magical beasts. One reason was that they were too heavy, and the other was that they did not have any special abilities. They could only spit out some acid to corrode their opponent. If all the magical beasts living in an area were top magical beasts, hydras could only be obedient with their tails between their legs. However, that dragon was still a young dragon. Even its dragon scales were not fully grown. Furthermore, the dragon's proficiency in dragon language magic was not unlimited. Gradually, the number of times it used magic became less and less. On the other hand, the attacks of the Hydra became more and more fierce. Finally, the Hydra seized the opportunity. A few of its heads spat out acid mist from above, attracting the attention of the baby dragon, while the other heads stretched out to the baby dragon's abdomen, biting it hard and dragging it forcefully. The baby dragon was dragged with its belly facing the sky. Naturally, the baby dragon was not willing to wait for its death. It opened its mouth and bit one of the Hydra's heads. The intense pain made the Hydra even more crazy. The remaining heads bit on the young dragon's abdomen with all their might. Pieces of flesh and blood flew everywhere. In the blink of an eye, a few bloody holes were torn into the young dragon's abdomen. However, the young dragon was in more pain, so it became even crazier. Not only did it not let go, but it also shook violently, trying to bite off one of the heads of the Hydra. Let's go. Sunir felt that it was time. The road to the battlefield was not long. It was only a few miles, but it was very difficult to walk. However, this was not a problem for the people who had fallen into a frenzy. There was no need for Morrisons to pave the way. The magicians were all running forward with all their might. It could even be said that they were rolling and crawling. When they arrived at the battlefield, the battle was already over. One of the heads of the Hydra was hanging limply on the ground, and the young dragon's chest was cut open, revealing a bloody mess of internal organs. Seeing a group of crazy people rushing out from the forest, the Hydra immediately roared to warn all the uninvited guests. However, Asa and the others did not care. They all began to cast spells. Lightning, fireballs, wind blades, and other spells rained down on the Hydra. There were even small fireballs. The two deacons were also casting healing spells, not caring whether their companions were injured or not. The Hydra clearly felt the hostility and rushed over with large strides. All kinds of spells fell on its body, but none of them had any effect. Although the Hydra was said to be slow, and its 2 legs were ridiculously short, everything was relative. The former was compared to other top-grade holy animals, while the latter was compared to its body length. In fact, the Hydra's 2 thick legs were 3 meters tall, and its huge body could be described as a giant. When it ran, it gave off a feeling that the earth was shaking and the mountains were shaking, making it hard for people to breathe. The faces of the young mages changed, and they hurriedly began to cast restraining spells, trying to block the Hydra with earth wall and fire wall. Unfortunately, with their magic power, the effect of the spells they cast was not optimistic. The fire wall and dragon breath were worlds apart. The Hydra was immune to such spells, and the earth wall was not as tall as the Hydra's legs, so it was even less effective. Roar! The Hydra roared again. The closer it was, the more shocking it was. People had to raise their heads to see the ferocious snake heads. Yelena had finished chanting her spell. She raised her magic staff forward, and a dazzling bolt of lightning shot out. It fell on the Hydra's body and turned into countless electric arcs that flowed out. Finally, it formed a giant net that firmly wrapped the Hydra in it. The Hydra's body stiffened, and then it fell to the ground with a bang. Its immeasurable weight was like an exploding cannonball, raising a cloud of smoke and dust. The Hydra struggled frantically, but the giant net made of lightning seemed to be elastic. No matter how the Hydra twisted, it could not break free from the lightning. Yelena heaved a sigh of relief, and then began chanting another spell. At this moment, an unexpected accident happened. The young magician closest to Yelena suddenly stabbed at her with his magic staff. At the end of the staff, there was a shiny blade. Yelena trusted her students and loved them. She had never thought that the attack would come from behind her. Moreover, a magician's reaction speed was not as fast as a warrior's. In her moment of shock, the sharp blade had pierced deeply into her back. "Warwick, are you crazy?" Asa roared with his eyes wide open. Yelena staggered. Suddenly, a flash of light shot out from her magic staff, and a bolt of lightning struck the attacking magician at close range. The power of the lightning released by a magus was unimaginable. The magician screamed in pain and was sent flying. Yelena struggled to turn around and look at her good student. Suddenly, a faint shadow appeared beside Yelena and swung a dagger at Yelena's neck at lightning speed. The first assassination was an accident, and the second assassination was even more unexpected. Yelena was still wondering why her student attacked her, and she didn't expect there to be another assassin. Although she had learned her lesson last time, in this situation, she couldn't use magic detection to look for possible thieves. However, at this time, Han Jin and Sunir both reacted. Just now, they were so focused on admiring Yelena's magic that they let their guard down. When the shadow appeared, Han Jin had already released a wooden golem. However, the opponent's attack was too fast, and he couldn't block it in time. He could only control the wooden golem to knock Yelena to the side. The dagger slashed Yelena's neck and blood splattered. The shadow didn't look at whether Yelena was dead or alive, turned around and fled. Yelena swayed and fell down. As she fell, a magic scroll quietly floated out and turned into a giant bolt of lightning, chasing after the assassin. If the lightning released by Yelena just now was as thick as a person's arm, then this one was a lightning pillar. The shadow was hit directly, and his whole body was sent flying. He hit a rock and stuck to it for a moment, then slowly slid down. Blood flowed out of the corner of his mouth and nose. Sunir had already drawn her longbow. Just as she was about to shoot an arrow, she suddenly saw a ray of black light from the corner of her eye. The speed of the black light was indescribably fast, even exceeding the limit of human reaction. However, Sunir's experience of life and death had already made her instincts. She subconsciously leaned to one side, and a powerful arrow shot into her shoulder and pierced through her body. With a thud, Sunir was nailed to a tree trunk. In a duel between archers, whoever was in the dark had the upper hand. Sunir had killed many archers from the enemy camp, but today it was her turn to be killed. At the same time, Leger appeared in front of the assassin and stabbed his dagger into the assassin's chest. In that split second, there was no time to analyze the opponent's strength. After Leger made his move, he realized that he had chosen the wrong position. The strength of the assassin's body was far beyond his expectations. Of course, the assassin also didn't expect to receive such a fatal blow. An ominous glint flashed in the assassin's eyes. He grabbed Leger's wrist with such force that Leger felt as if his hand was being held in place by an iron band. He couldn't move at all. Then, the dagger went straight for Leger's chest. Leger reacted quickly and grabbed the assassin's wrist. After a moment of stalemate, victory was decided. He could only watch as the dagger inched closer and closer to his chest. In his panic, Leger struggled with his right hand, trying to inflict more damage with his dagger while desperately dodging. Ah! The assassin roared and pushed forward with all his strength. Leger's dagger went a few inches deep into the assassin's body. The tip of the dagger even penetrated the assassin's body and pressed against the rock behind him. The distance between the two was naturally reduced by a few inches. Then, the assassin used all his strength to stab at Leger's chest. Leger used all his strength to move back and avoid being hit in his vitals. The dagger only left a deep wound under his ribs. In the twinkling of an eye, both the assassin and the victim had paid a great price. Han Jin and the others were here to reap the fruits of their labor, but none of them had expected that their encounter would be even more tragic than the fight between holy animals. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 159. When Sunir was hit by the arrow, Morrisons quickly stood in front of Sunir. Sasu immediately released a magic shield, covering all three of them, and then cast a magic shield on himself. Han Jin looked ahead quietly. Although he had already cast spirit possession, the situation had changed too quickly. First, Sunir was hit, and when he looked at Sunir, Leger was also injured. He really had no ability to support anyone. The battle between Leger and the assassin was coming to an end. The assassin was first seriously injured by Yelena's scroll, then pierced through by Leger's dagger. He was like an arrow at the end of its flight. Under such circumstances, the assassin was still able to injure Leger. It could only be said that his strength was too strong. At this time, a faint cry of sorrow came from the forest. Han Jin's expression suddenly changed. With a flick of his wrist, a wooden golem appeared beside Leger out of thin air. At the same time, a black light shot out from the forest and hit the wooden golem. Leger immediately reacted. He covered his wound and staggered back a few steps. Then, he activated invisibility and disappeared into thin air. Han Jin silently observed the forest. Although the archer had already launched 2 attacks, he still couldn't find his hiding place. Morrisons and the others didn't dare to move. Looking at the speed of the arrow, which was even faster than Sunir's arrow, they could only firmly guard Sunir and vigilantly observe the surroundings. Ace's students didn't understand the horror of their opponent. They surrounded Yelena with sorrowful faces, and various cries came from their mouths. Fortunately, the enemy didn't care about them and didn't attack them. The genius sorceress was covered in blood and lying on the ground without a sound. No one knew whether she was dead or not. After a moment, Han Jin suddenly snorted coldly. The wooden puppet used to save Leger moved and punched the assassin. The assassin was only on the verge of death, and still had a few breaths of life left. After being punched by the wooden puppet, blood immediately gushed out from his mouth and nose. The wooden golem did not stop, and continued to punch the assassin. The muffled thuds sounded exceptionally cruel in the silent forest. The assassin did not even have the strength to vomit blood. He could no longer stand and fell to the ground. However, the wooden golem did not let the assassin go. Every time its fist landed, the assassin's body would twitch. Finally, the archer in the forest couldn't take it anymore. A hoarse voice rang out, "All of you will die." A streak of black light shot out from the forest and hit the wooden golem's head. However, the wooden golem was not a normal human. Even after being hit in the head, it did not affect its ability to move. It was still seriously punching the assassin's body. The archer in the forest paused for a moment. Then, the concentrated sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out. Several arrows whizzed out from the forest almost at the same time, hitting the wooden golem's joints one after another. These arrows were all enchanted. They did not simply pierce through the wooden golem. Instead, they exploded on the wooden golem. In the blink of an eye, the wooden golem's 2 arms were blown off. Han Jin finally found the archer's position. He moved at the same time and rushed straight forward. However, after just 2 steps, he suddenly stopped. In front of the archer, a magician in a purple robe suddenly appeared. The magician was about 30 years old and had a baby face. He looked very easygoing, but Han Jin smelled a very dangerous aura. "Why are you so late?" the archer said in a hoarse voice. "Daisy, what do you mean?" The magician frowned. "You said that I couldn't hide my elemental aura in front of Yelena and didn't let me follow her. Now you're blaming me? I sensed your signal and came here immediately. How fast do you want me to go?" But, the archer paused. Recalling the battle scene, she couldn't blame her companions. It was too fast. The battle was almost over in the blink of an eye. But, Upton, I already know. The magician's eyes fell on Han Jin. "It was this puppet master who did it, right? Don't kill him so easily." The archer gnashed her teeth. "I want to torture him bit by bit. You will get what you want." The magician paused. "Actually, leaving Mr. Upton is not a bad choice for you. Don't be too sad." The magician did what he said. There was no trace of sadness on his face. On the contrary, there was a happy smile on his face. "Terence," the archer roared. Okay, pretend I didn't say anything." The magician smiled and slowly walked out of the forest. The archer coldly looked at her companion's back and then turned her eyes to the other side. Morrison suddenly stopped and slowly stepped back. He wanted to help Han Jin, but compared to him, Sunir was in more danger. If the archer continued to attack Sunir, he was afraid that Sasu wouldn't be able to handle it alone. "Let me introduce myself. My name is Terence." The magician smiled at Han Jin. Then, he paused for a moment and raised his wand. A white ice ring with him as the center quickly rolled down. Leger was swept out by the ice ring, but his reaction was just as fast. He somersaulted out of the range of the ice ring and disappeared into the air. "You'd better stay away from me, thief." The magician named Terence smiled. "You should know that it is very dangerous to challenge someone of a higher level. Our great Mr. Upton is a good example, isn't he?" Han Jin's body began to move. He directly rushed towards Terence. In terms of long-range attack, he couldn't compare with a magician. He had to take the initiative. "You overestimate yourself," Terence sneered and raised his wand. Clouds of white mist appeared around Han Jin and quickly moved towards Han Jin. Han Jin suddenly felt the air become very cold. The thick mist stuck to his body and turned into bright ice crystals. There were more and more ice crystals, and they were getting thicker and thicker. Han Jin's body shrunk. Just like Leger, he silently disappeared. Terence was stunned for a moment. Then, Han Jin rose from behind him and punched him in the back. Boom! When Han Jin's fist was about to hit the target, small mirror-like objects suddenly appeared on Terence's body. It was Terence's ice armor. However, Han Jin's strength was very strong. He broke the ice armor and the tip of his fist finally touched Terence's shoulder. Han Jin certainly wouldn't change his target. Terence's shoulder was not a vital part of his body. At this critical moment, Terence suddenly turned his body sideways and stabbed backwards with his wand. For the first time, neither of them had the upper hand. Terence staggered forward a few steps, while Han Jin let out a muffled groan. Terence looked at Han Jin in surprise. "You're a puppet master? You're a magician?" Han Jin asked tit for tat. Terence's strength was very strong. His chest was still aching. He had cast spirit possession and his body had become very strong. Just the wand alone was enough to make him feel pain. What if it was a knife? "I forgot to introduce myself." Terence smiled and moved his shoulder. Obviously, he didn't feel good after taking that punch. "I'm a battle magician, a pure battle magician." "Then I'm a battle puppet master," Han Jin said calmly. "Interesting." Terence chuckled and began to chant a spell. Han Jin's figure shot forward like a bolt of lightning. The distance between the two was already very close. In the blink of an eye, he had closed in on Terence. Terence took a step back and gently waved his wand. A somewhat turbid semicircular ice wall appeared and firmly enveloped Terence. A mirror-like layer of ice also appeared under his feet. Clearly, this was to prevent Han Jin from burrowing out of the ground and attacking him again. Han Jin punched the ice wall with his fist. Countless cracks appeared on the ice wall where Han Jin's fists landed. Han Jin took a deep breath and punched out alternately with his fists, leaving one afterimage after another in the air. His fists fell on the ice wall like raindrops, shattering countless ice chips and splashing all over the place. Even his hair was covered with ice chips. Terence finally finished chanting his spell. With the movement of his wand, snowflakes appeared in the sultry forest. Then one, then dozens, and finally countless snowflakes floated down from the sky. Looking from the outside, even Han Jin and Terence's figures could not be seen clearly. The snowflakes did not fall to the ground. Instead, they danced and spun around Terence like living fairies, sparkling and beautiful. However, Han Jin could not see anything. He could only close his eyes. The countless snowflakes were like countless lethal weapons. They circled around him, trying to cut his body. Before he closed his eyes, he saw countless small tears on his sleeves. The ice wall that Terence had cast suddenly cracked open. A white snowball flew out and hit Han Jin. Han Jin staggered back a dozen steps before he could stabilize himself. Then, he heard Terence's arrogant laughter. "Battle puppet master? No one has been able to fight against me while I'm protected by my blizzard protection. Come, let me see how you fight. Don't worry about me. Go help Raphael." Sunir gritted her teeth. The arrow had damaged her internal organs, so she could not help but cough softly. Every time she coughed, blood would flow out from her nose and mouth. Morrisons and Sassu did not dare to touch the arrow. They were not priests. The only person who could save Sunir was Raphael. Morrisons hesitated for a moment. At this moment, the archer in the distance seemed to have noticed their intentions. He raised his hand and shot an arrow. The arrow whistled through the air and flew straight towards Sunir. Morrisons rushed forward and blocked the arrow with his greatsword. With a boom, a ball of fire exploded on Morrison's greatsword. He took a few steps back and almost bumped into Sunir. Sassu and Morrisons looked at each other. Their hearts sank. If Morrisons left, Sassu would not be able to protect Sunir. "Go," Sunir said angrily. "Go help Raphael." Morrisons did not know what to say. "Are you going or not?" Sunir suddenly grabbed the arrow. "No. Sunir, please don't." Morrison's face turned pale. At this moment, a deafening roar sounded. It was the Hydra. No matter what kind of magic it was, it would disappear eventually. The lightning net was getting dimmer and dimmer. "Ha ha!" Terence's laughter became more and more rampant. "It seems that you have to knock me down as soon as possible. Otherwise, Hydra will kill all of you without me doing anything." Chapter 160. Han Jin roared and dashed forward. Now, Morrisons and Sassu were pinned down, and Leger could not hurt Terence, who was protected by the blizzard protection. The young magicians were not reliable at all. All the burden was on Terrence's shoulders. Terrence grinned and fearlessly faced Han Jin head-on. Although he was not as strong and fast as Han Jin, he could cast spells at any time and place. The ice ring slowed down Han Jin's speed, and the icicle was extremely lethal. When he was attacked, he could cast ice wall and ice armor, which greatly increased his defense. He could even use his wand to fight with Han Jin. There was also a layer of hard ice that moved with his body. A professional with rich combat experience would not give his enemy the same chance twice. He was always on guard against Han Jin's strange magic. No matter what, Terrence had the upper hand. Han Jin's speed was getting slower and slower. Terrence took the opportunity and cast 3 ice rings in succession, almost turning Han Jin into an iceman. Then, a huge icicle appeared in his hand and whistled towards Han Jin's chest. Han Jin used the last of his strength to take a step back, and then his body shrank into the ground. The next moment, he appeared dozens of meters away, far away from the blizzard protection. "Ha ha!" Terrence laughed wildly. "You gave up just like that? What a disappointment!" At this moment, the young magicians suddenly started arguing. A male magician kicked Asa to the ground, then grabbed a magic scroll and was about to release it. With a flash of dark light, a powerful arrow shot out, and the impact of the arrow tore the magic scroll into countless pieces. Then, the next arrow accurately pierced the male magician's throat. He waved his arms and fell to the ground. The young magicians all looked desperate. They had been arguing with each other, and some of them had insisted on releasing the space scroll and returning to isolated Cliff City. However, Asa had refused. He didn't want to be a deserter. Even if he wanted to escape, he wanted to take the guides with him. It was clear that the assassins were here for Dean Yelena, and the mercenaries were fighting to the death to protect them. He couldn't do such a despicable thing. At this moment of life and death, the prestige that Asa had accumulated over the years seemed to pale in comparison. A few mages who were bent on escaping actually used violence to snatch the magic scrolls. Unfortunately, they had overlooked the cruelty and meticulousness of the enemy. However, Han Jin was not in the mood to care about what was happening behind him. His eyes swept over the arrogant Terrence, the sneering archer, and the hydra that might break free from the electric net in 1 or 10 minutes. Suddenly, Han Jin smiled, and his smile was very relaxed. Han Jin cast a charm of spirit refreshment on himself and tidied up his tattered and messy robe. To be honest, he was very afraid of death, so he was also very selfish. Morrison's had begged him to cast a substitute puppet spell on himself, but Han Jin had always rejected Morrison's because the first thing that Han Jin had to consider was his own safety. That day, he had rushed into Black Raven City alone and killed everyone. In the eyes of others, he was a fearless warrior, but if it were not for the protection of the faked Earth Corps, he would never have gone in. Reputation meant nothing to him. But the world was so strange. Or perhaps God was so heartless. Whatever he feared, it would happen. Of course, he could use the Earthmeld to escape far away, regardless of the life or death of anyone. But the question was, could he really do that? Asa did not want to leave earlier because he had his own conscience. But now, Han Jin could not leave because he had already regarded Morrison's and Sasu as his true friends. In fact, it was not easy to be a fearless deserter. He had to abandon everything that he once thought was beautiful, have the courage to bear the curses of the world, and be prepared to live a life of complete isolation. Come to think of it, this was even more difficult than death. From now on, no one would care about his happiness, anger, sorrow, or joy. He would be mocked, rolled his eyes, and even ostracized from society. Living in such a situation was torture. Han Jin turned back to look at Morrison's. His eyes were bright and spirited, and his smile was clear and bright. At this moment, Han Jin no longer looked like a warrior bathed in blood. Instead, he looked like a young man holding a bouquet of flowers, standing at the entrance of the village, ready to welcome his lover. Morrisons and Sassu could not help but stare blankly. They had known Han Jin for more than a year, and they had never seen Han Jin smile so happily. Could it be that he already had the confidence to win? No, Raphael, don't, Sunir suddenly cried out. Some women's intuition was frighteningly sharp, and Sunir was one of the best. Moreover, at least half of her heart was devoted to Han Jin. Although she could not explain the reason, she knew that Han Jin's smile was not a good thing. And those eyes that were full of warmth clearly had a sense of farewell. Still not giving up? Terence sneered. Han Jin turned around and looked at Terence. He said softly, "Come with me." What? Terence did not understand and asked subconsciously. "Ha ha." Han Jin let out a clear laugh. He was really relaxed now. It was like a person standing at the edge of a cliff. The most difficult thing was to decide whether or not to take that step. Pain, reluctance, hesitation, and so on were all tormenting and testing a person's will. But when it was time to jump, all of these worries no longer existed, and there was no need for them to exist. Han Jin had already formed a sword seal and shouted, "Go!" The scabbard at Han Jin's waist trembled violently. Then, a bright sword light suddenly exploded, twisting the scabbard into pieces. It used to be an ordinary longsword, but in Han Jin's hands, it blossomed with a peerless brilliance. It was like a dragon that was born in the wilderness. It was incomparably light and carried a supreme majesty. Every 10 meters or so, it would explode with a fireworks-like tail flame composed purely of flowing light. In the eyes of outsiders, this was a manifestation of elemental energy overflowing. However, Han Jin knew that every time a tail flame exploded, it represented the dissipation of a talisman that had exhausted its spiritual energy. Han Jin had spent a lot of effort on this sword because his realm was not high enough to use a flying sword. When he was free, he would add nearly 100 talismans to the flying sword. When he was busy, he would try his best to squeeze out a few more talismans. Up until now, he had already lost count of how many talismans he had added. He only knew that when the talismans burned out, his life would also come to an end. When he was in the West Biteman City, he had almost used the flying sword to deal with Gerald. Fortunately, the sudden appearance of the vampire had helped him a lot. Unfortunately, he could only help himself now. The flying sword broke into the snow wind protection barrier. In such a short distance, it had already used up 3 talismans, leaving a tail flame that was more than 10 meters long behind it. Those headache-inducing snowflakes had no effect on the flying sword. The dazzling sword light firmly locked onto Terence's body. Terence's expression became serious. He raised his hand and released an ice wall. He didn't expect to use the ice wall to block the strange longsword. He only wanted to test the strength of his opponent's magic. Han Jin sneered. The flying sword flew up in an incomparably agile manner, floating over the ice wall and continuing to approach Terence. Terence hurriedly added another ice wall, firmly blocking himself inside. The flying sword shot forward and lightly scratched the ice wall like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water. With a loud explosion, the ice wall turned into countless fragments and shot out in all directions. At the same time, the flying sword also burst into a huge ball of flame. Then, the flying sword shot downwards like lightning. Terence's expression changed. When the flying sword was about to hit his chest, his figure suddenly disappeared. In the next moment, he reappeared dozens of meters away. Teleportation. This type of spatial magic was similar to Han Jin's Earthmeld. However, while Han Jin could use Earthmeld without limit, this type of magic had a corresponding cooldown. Terence could only move his body, but he couldn't bring the snow-wind protection barrier with him. When Terence appeared, the wind and snow that filled the sky rushed towards him. Han Jin made a hand seal and the flying sword flashed. It surpassed the fluttering snowflakes and shot straight towards Terence. Terence waved his magic staff and a huge ice ball appeared out of thin air, meeting the flying sword head-on. The flying sword seemed to have a life of its own. It suddenly dipped down, brushing past the ice ball and shooting along the ground. To Morrison's and the others, this was only a new type of magic released by Han Jin. They couldn't experience the power of the flying sword. However, Terence, who was in the middle of it, knew his own difficulties. At the very least, the unpredictable and sudden speed of the flying sword made him feel a great deal of pressure. The magic staff in Terence's hand slammed down, and a ring of ice spread out in all directions with him as the center. The flying sword nimbly raised its head and pierced upwards diagonally, causing the mist-like ice waves to hit nothing but air. In the next moment, the flying sword flashed behind Terence. Terence wanted to lock onto the flying sword with his gaze, but it was too late. "Hosersai, help me!" Terence yelled and then released a spell. His body was firmly sealed in layers of ice. Icebound, also known as Ice Coffin, was originally a spell used to store some rare items. The effect of Icebound could last for a long time. The ice was very solid and would not melt even if it was exposed to the sun for a long time. However, it was not very useful in a real battle. Terence used Icebound to protect himself, which was a classic example of applying what he learned in a practical way. However, on the other hand, it also proved his helplessness. The magic attacks that he was good at could not touch the flying sword at all. Even the ice wall could not protect him. Ice armor was even more unreliable. If he wanted to release other spells, he would not have the time to recite the incantation. The most important thing now was to stay alive, at least until the cooldown of the teleportation spell was over. The archer named Hosersai was stunned. She only woke up when she heard Terence's yell. She pulled her longbow and aimed at Han Jin. A wooden figure appeared in front of Han Jin, blocking Hosersai's sight. Morrison's had already rushed out like a fierce tiger. Hosersai suddenly sensed something. She shot an arrow randomly and then retreated as fast as she could. At the same time, Leger appeared beside her. He tried to stab her with his shining dagger, but it hit nothing. Leger was severely injured. His speed and strength were greatly reduced. Otherwise, Hosersai would not have been able to escape from his attack range so easily. The flying sword floated in the air and retreated bit by bit. Terence, who was trapped in the ice coffin, looked at the flying sword nervously. Of course, he would not completely seal himself. This was a spell release technique. Wait a little longer. Terence roared in his heart. Just a little longer and he would be able to release teleportation again. Unfortunately, Han Jin could not afford to wait. He was like a burning candle. Every movement of the flying sword was burning his life force. A dazzling light appeared on the flying sword. Then, a stream of light hit the ice coffin with great force. With a loud bang, the ice coffin was shattered into countless crystal fragments. The fragments shot out in all directions and formed a dazzling firework that covered an area of dozens of square meters. Terence's eyes dimmed. There was a bloody hole in his chest that was thicker than the rim of a bowl. Then, his body swayed and gradually fell to the ground. Han Jin performed another spell. The flying sword nodded lightly in the air. Then it flew past Leger and Morrison's and headed straight for Hosersai. Hosersai was scared out of her wits. She screamed and ran straight into the forest. However, it was impossible for her to race against the flying sword with her legs. No matter how powerful an archer was, she could not turn herself into a stream of light. With a shrill sound, the flying sword pierced the back of Hosersai's head. Hosersai used all her strength to jump to one side. The flying sword missed its target. Then, Han Jin performed another spell. The flying sword turned into a shadow and shot towards Hosersai's neck. Hosersai tried her best to dodge the flying sword. She was in a panic and bumped into an ancient tree. However, Leger and Morrison's who were chasing after her couldn't see her rolling pupils. Hosersai waited for a while. When the flying sword was about to hit her, she suddenly leaned to one side. The flying sword brushed past her neck and hit the ancient tree. The proud smile on Hosersai's face became stiff again. She saw a flash of sword light coming from behind the tree. The thick ancient tree couldn't stop the flying sword at all. Hosersai screamed again. She rolled and crawled to the side. Han Jin wouldn't show mercy to his enemy just because she had turned into a reptile. The flying sword paused in the air and then shot towards Hosersai's back. No one paid attention to Han Jin. His face turned from red to pale, and then from pale to livid. Now, his cheeks were as dark as a dead man's. Compared with the beginning, the speed of the flying sword had slowed down a lot. Hosersai turned over and jumped up. Once again, the flying sword missed its target. Most of the sword blade had sunk into the ground. Hosersai suddenly swung her longbow and hit the flying sword heavily. Han Jin in the distance shook. A wisp of blood oozed out from the corner of his mouth. Hosersai hit the flying sword again. With a crack, her longbow was broken. Fortunately, she wasn't holding Morrison's huge sword. Otherwise, Han Jin would have been killed on the spot. The flying sword trembled violently. Hosersai was so anxious that she stretched out her foot and stepped on the flying sword. Han Jin shouted in a low voice and changed several hand gestures. The flying sword suddenly retreated from the soil. Hosersai missed her step and almost fell down. Before she could react, the flying sword had pierced through her left leg with a flash of light and a splash of blood. Ah! Hosersai screamed and fell down involuntarily. It was reasonable to say that Leger should be the first to arrive. However, it was very difficult for him to move. Morrison's had already left him far behind. Morrison's was not a kind man. Now that his anger was aroused, he didn't say anything. He swung his sword and slashed down furiously. His target was Hosersai's right leg. Morrison's heard it clearly. Didn't you want to torture Han Jin bit by bit? Then you should be prepared to be tortured. As an archer who had lost her longbow and injured her leg, she couldn't protect herself at all. She could only look at the falling sword with despair. Puff! Blood splashed again. Half of Hosersai's leg was cut off. The severe pain made Hosersai scream more and more miserably. Morrison's kicked Hosersai's cheek and grinned. Didn't you want to torture us? Come on. Come on. At this moment a terrible roar came. Morrison's face changed greatly. Hosersai showed an almost twisted smile. Ha ha, you will die with me. Ha ha. Before her laughter died away, Moxink's sword had already swept across her neck. A bloody head flew up high and rolled down in the grass. The ferocious smile froze on her face. Morrison's didn't bother to look at the body. He strode out of the forest with his longsword. Han Jin was already at the end of his rope, but he couldn't relax. The electric net around the Hydra's body was already very dim. Perhaps the Hydra would rush out at the next moment. The flying sword drifted over. The light on the flying sword was not as dazzling as before, and its speed was not as light as before. However, its target was clear, firm, and unshakable. Every time the flying sword attacked, it would consume more than a dozen or even hundreds of talismans. Especially the sword that broke the ice coffin by force, it almost consumed all of his energy. Now Han Jin was driving the flying sword with his own energy, which was far beyond what he could bear. The Hydra was still curled up in the electric net. Its ferocious eyes stared at the flying sword. Instinctively, it sensed that the little thing was extremely lethal. Han Jin's body was on the verge of collapsing, but his hand gestures were exceptionally clear and accurate. The flying sword paused for a moment before shooting down. A deep wound had been bitten by the young dragon on the back of the Hydra. The flying sword flashed and disappeared into the wound. Han Jin sighed softly. Then, a thunderous roar resounded in the forest. Break! With a loud bang, Han Jin's flying sword was instantly shattered into countless pieces. Each of the pieces turned into a turbulent flow of energy that could penetrate metal and stone, mercilessly tearing apart the Hydra's muscles and internal organs. A fountain of blood gushed out from the wound on the Hydra's back, reaching a height of more than 10 meters. The wound on the Hydra's back had turned into a bottomless bloody hole that was several meters wide. The Hydra let out a painful roar and struggled with all its might. However, Han Jin couldn't see or hear any of this. His legs sank and he knelt on the ground. Then, he softly lay there. Raphael! Morrison's cried out in surprise and joy. However, when he picked up Han Jin and saw Han Jin's lifeless face, his voice suddenly began to tremble. He sounded like a beast wailing, "Raphael! Dragon's blood!" Sunir's mind flashed. She was the only one here who knew Han Jin's secret. She was also the only one who could think of a way. Sunir screamed, "Let him drink the dragon's blood! Quickly!" "What?" Sasu was stunned. "Quickly!" Sunir anxiously cried out. Then, her head and body dropped down. Chapter 161. It was an endless darkness. It was extremely quiet and cold, but Han Jin could not feel anything. The last attack was to perish together with the Hydra. When the flying sword broke, his consciousness began to drift away. He could only silently sink into the darkness. Suddenly, a small flame lit up on the dark plains. The flame was very dim, like a small candle. Compared to the endless darkness, it was insignificant. However, the flame continued to burn stubbornly. The flames grew bigger and bigger until it became a bonfire floating in the air. Perhaps it was because he felt a trace of warmth, or because the flame was too bright in the darkness, Han Jin's consciousness stopped sinking. He regained a little consciousness. The flame seemed to have a life of its own. It kept growing and expanding. After an unknown amount of time, the flame had spread from a lake of fire to an endless sea of fire. The darkness that once dominated the world had long been expelled. The bone-chilling cold had nowhere to hide in the flame. Although he could not hear any sound, he could feel the roar of the flame. The dancing sea of fire was extremely vast. No matter where Han Jin looked, he could not see the end of the sea of fire. Han Jin suddenly had a very strange feeling. It was as if there were two of him. One of him was far away, silently observing the burning world. The other was a speck of dust in the sea of fire. As soon as this feeling appeared, a huge suction force sucked the speck of dust out of the sea of fire and threw it toward his other self, who was extremely far away. When the two of them merged with each other, Han Jin felt a burst of light in front of his eyes, and all his senses came back. He could feel the soreness in his body, and even hear the whispers of people around him. Han Jin suddenly understood. The endless sea of fire was actually the fire in his dantian. It was also the fire of life. You still want to give it to him? Is that enough? Han Jin heard Sasua's voice. It's not like you don't know how much Raphael eats, Morrison's replied. Moxink replied, I'm sure he can eat the whole dragon if he wants to. Do you believe me? Well, Cessation looked back at the young dragon, which was as huge as a hill. Aren't you exaggerating? Exaggerating? Why didn't you say that when Raphael ate the earth bear? As soon as he finished speaking, Han Jin felt someone pry open his mouth. Then, a fishy liquid poured in. Han Jin subconsciously wanted to spit it out, but his body muscles did not listen to him. He could not even open his eyelids, let alone his throat and tongue. However, his body seemed to be in great need of those smelly things. His throat wriggled a few times, and he swallowed all the liquid. Han Jin had a creepy feeling. What was going on? He was supposed to spit it out. Look, Morrison's was still prying Han Jin's mouth open. Raphael drank it all. He drank more than 20 cups, right? Sasu smiled bitterly. I'm afraid something will happen. What will happen? Morrison said with disdain. Sasu, let me ask you. Who in this world will not harm Raphael? Neither of us would harm Raphael, because we are friends, aren't we? Why are you in such a hurry to flaunt yourself? Morrison said. I'm asking who will not harm Raphael. Stillberg. Sassu replied. I can see that even if Raphael asked him to die immediately, he would not hesitate. You! Morrison said angrily. Are you purposely arguing with me? Then who do you think it is? Sunir, Morrison said. You're asking who will not harm Raphael. Sunir only likes Raphael. Compared to Stillberg, go away, I'm not talking to you anymore. Morrison said angrily. Then, he pried open Han Jin's mouth. Han Jin did not have time to analyze what Morrison's had given him. Although he could not control his body, he could feel the changes in his body. Heat. Unbearable heat. What he drank was not liquid, but lava. Dragons were top-tier magical beasts, after all. The energy contained in their bodies was frighteningly large. The energy of a dragon crystal was calculated in terms of tai. 10,000 xian was 1 tai, and 10,000 jia was 1 xian. Han Jin's energy was only close to 1,000 jia. The difference between the former and the latter was like heaven and earth. Han Jin desperately wanted to open his mouth, hoping to expel some of the unbearable heat. Unfortunately, this was only wishful thinking. His dantian could no longer contain the heat. Waves of heat were spreading to his limbs and bones. Then, there was a knife-like pain. Every inch of his skin and every strand of his blood vessels were undergoing a severe test. It was not a big deal if he only felt pain in one place, but from his hair to his toes, every part of his body was in extreme pain. How was this different from death by 1,000 cuts? Just as Han Jin was trying to endure the pain, he suddenly heard Morrison say, "You, go get some more dragon blood." Han Jin almost broke down. If his soul could break down, he wanted to shout loudly, "No more!" But he could not shout anything. The next moment, his mouth was forced open again, and mouthfuls of damned dragon blood flowed down his throat. Han Jin felt as if his entire body was burning. The pain was as if there was some kind of power constantly crushing his skin and flesh. In fact, his will was very strong, but at this moment, he wanted to beg for mercy. He really wanted to beg for mercy. "What is that?" Sassu suddenly said in surprise. Steam had already risen from Han Jin's body. His limbs, chest, and cheeks were all trembling uncontrollably. "There's a reaction." Morrison's University was delighted. "Quick! Dragon blood! Are you sure you want to give it to Raphael?" Sassu asked hesitantly. "Isn't there a reaction now? It proves that we're right." Han Jin could no longer hear what Morrison's and Sassu were saying. He saw the boundless sea of fire again. He did not know if the range of the sea of fire had increased because he could not find the end of the sea of fire. But the tongue of fire had turned bright gold. It was pure and shining, as if it was real. Outside Han Jin's body, Morrison's was immersed in joy and drank cup after cup of dragon blood. He did not understand what dragon blood meant to Han Jin. With every cup of dragon blood he drank, Han Jin's vital fire burned brighter. In that strange world, the tongues of fire had almost reached the sky and extended down to the bottomless abyss. In the end, countless tongues of fire disappeared at the same time. Because every inch of space was filled with fire, there was no room for the tongues of fire to dance. Naturally, the tongues of fire no longer existed. That young dragon was the descendant of the superior gold dragon. It came to the Terasha Mountains for special reasons and invaded the Hydra's territory. That was why it started a fight to the death. The dragon blood contained a huge amount of magic power. Although it could not be compared to the dragon crystal, it was already too much for Han Jin to bear. However, this kind of magic power dissipated easily. When the time came, it could only be used as an alchemy material. Many people knew that dragon blood contained magic power. It was just that those who had the ability to kill dragons were too lazy to collect dragon blood. What attracted their attention was the dragon crystal, dragon scales, and dragon bones. These things were far more valuable than dragon blood. But for Han Jin, who was equivalent to an intermediate professional, dragon blood was the most important thing. If there was no accident, Han Jin would not be able to taste the dragon blood. He did not have the habit of drinking blood. Sunir and Sasu, who knew this common sense, would only focus on the dragon crystal, dragon scales, and dragon bones. Similarly, they would not remind Han Jin. To be able to drink the dragon blood before the magic power dissipated, this was Han Jin's great fortune. However, at this moment, Han Jin definitely did not feel lucky. He was still struggling in pain. The golden light became denser and denser, filling every corner. In the beginning, his consciousness could fly freely in his life sea and pass through every flame. However, as the light became more and more clear, the movements of his consciousness became slower and slower. In the end, he could not even move. Then, he had a feeling of suffocation. After a long time, he did not know how much dragon blood the damn Morrisons drank. With a boom, a dull explosion sounded in Han Jin's life sea. The crystal-like light was shattered into pieces. Then, all the light collapsed in the same place. Han Jin's consciousness could not stay in the life sea any longer and was violently ejected. "We can't let Raphael drink anymore," Sasu shouted. "Look!" Tiny drops of blood had already seeped out of Han Jin's body. When he wiped it with his hand, it was bright red. Sasu raised his hand and glared at Morrisons. But, seeing this scene, Morrisons became uncertain. Then, he clenched his teeth and said, "One last cup." "You're crazy." Sasu rushed forward to snatch the cup filled with dragon blood from Morrisons's hand. However, another hand suddenly reached out from the side and grabbed the cup first. "Raphael, you're awake?" Morrisons University shouted. Han Jin opened his eyes and looked at Morrisons. At this moment, he should have jumped up and turned Morrisons into a pig's head. This was because he had already sworn many times when he was in extreme pain. "Raphael, how are you feeling?" Sasu also shouted. "Let me rest for a while. I'm tired." Han Jin slowly closed his eyes. He was really tired. Not only his body, but also his soul. However, the burning pain in his throat reminded him that he had lost too much water. Han Jin had no choice but to open his eyes again. "Do you have water?" "Yes." Sasu hurriedly took out his water bag. "Don't you have water in your hand?" Morrisons winked and said, "Just treat it as water. Don't be afraid. You've already drunk a lot. One could defy heaven's wrath, but one could not escape from one's own sins." Morrisons should never have rubbed salt on Han Jin's wounds before they healed. Han Jin's eyes suddenly lit up. Although his pupils were black, they strangely emitted two cold golden rays. Then, Morrisons let out a strange cry. His body was lifted off the ground and flew more than 20 meters away. After landing, he rolled a few times before he could stabilize himself. Han Jin did not attack. He only grabbed Morrisons by the collar and threw him away. Although Morrisons did not release his combat aura, Han Jin's strength was immeasurable to be able to throw such a burly man so far away like a chick. Chapter 162. "Raphael, how did you become so strong?" Morrisons cried out. In fact, this was enough to prove the trust between them. If there was a barrier between them, the moment Han Jin grabbed Morrison's collar, Morrisons would have thought that Han Jin was trying to attack him, and would have reacted quickly. However, Morrisons did not release his Do-Chi from the beginning to the end. Not only did he trust Han Jin, but he also instinctively let his guard down against Han Jin. A faint smile appeared on Han Jin's face. No one could remain calm in that kind of unbearable pain, but now that he had returned to normal, his resentment towards Morrisons had also disappeared. Han Jin had never been a calculative person, and he knew very well that if it weren't for Morrisons, he would never have been able to cultivate the art of alchemy. Looking at the cup filled with blood in his hand, Han Jin raised his hand and poured the dragon's blood into his mouth. At this moment, the dragon's blood was no longer as unbearably hot as before. It was only left with a warm feeling. Raphael, do you know that you look like a barbarian right now? Morrison's giggled as he came over. At this moment, a cry of surprise came from the other side. Han Jin turned his head and saw Sunir, who was lying on the bluestone, coughing violently. Every time she coughed, she would spit out a mouthful of blood. The mask on her face was already crooked, but the deacon in charge of taking care of the injured did not dare to take the mask off. Sunir! Sasu exclaimed. Then, he saw Han Jin cross the distance of more than 10 meters at an astonishing speed and quietly stood beside Sunir. After the battle, Morrisons used his sword to cut off the arrows and carried Sunir here. One of the deacons happened to have 2 Holy Spirit blessing scrolls. The Holy Spirit blessing scrolls could not heal injuries, but could only prevent them from worsening. The scrolls would last for about 3 days. The problem was that their scrolls had been destroyed. Not to mention 3 days, even if they had 30 days, they would not be able to return to isolated Cliff City. There was no way they could ask for help. Therefore, the young magicians all looked worried. When they saw that Han Jin had woken up from his coma, they did not look happy at all. It was not that they were heartless. Except for Sunir, no one knew what kind of price Han Jin had paid. Morrisons and Sasu only had a vague idea. Han Jin silently looked at the arrow stuck under Sunir's shoulder. Although this arrow did not have any magic power, the craftsmanship was very vicious. The shaft of the arrow was covered with long and short barbs. No matter if the arrow was pulled out in reverse or along the shaft, it would cause more severe injuries to the person who was hit. Raphael, how are you? How is Sunir? Morrisons asked hurriedly. She's fine, Han Jin said softly. At this moment, he realized that his voice was very hoarse. He turned his head and saw that Sasu was still holding the water bag in his hand. He reached out and took the water bag, raised his head, and drank all the water in the bag in one breath. Is she really fine? Sasu looked worried. Sunir was still coughing blood. How could she be fine with this kind of injury? Her lungs are injured. Han Jin looked up at the sky. How long have I been out? Almost half a day. That's right. Han Jin nodded. Sunir vomited blood. She has to vomit it all out. Otherwise, there will be pain in the future. Oh. Morrisons and Sasu nodded. They did not fully understand. Han Jin waited for a while. When he saw that Sunir was no longer coughing blood, he began to draw a talisman in the air. In the past, when Han Jin used talismans, Morrisons and Sasu could not see anything. They could only see a faint light when the talisman took effect. However, this time was different. Countless golden stars flew out from Han Jin's fingers and floated in the air, forming a strange talisman. Morrisons and Sasu were stunned. Han Jin waved his hand and shouted, "Go!" The talisman turned into a golden light and attached itself to the shaft of the arrow. Han Jin waited for a while. Then, he reached out and grabbed the feather of the arrow, pulling it out bit by bit. If anyone else dared to do this, Morrisons would have drawn his sword and killed them. Even though he trusted Han Jin, he could not help but suck in a cold breath. Sunir, on the other hand, was very quiet. It was as if she did not feel anything. Soon, Han Jin pulled the entire arrow out. Moxink's eyes popped out. The shaft of the arrow became as soft as a snake, and the vicious barbs were swaying in the wind like a piece of soft blood-red fluff. The arrow was stained with Sunir's blood. Han Jin threw the arrow shaft to the ground. The arrow shaft twisted a few times as it landed on the ground. It was as if it was alive. The golden light quickly disappeared from the arrow shaft. When Morrisons kicked it out of curiosity, the arrow shaft had already become hard again. A wound as thick as a finger appeared under Sunir's shoulder. Fresh blood flowed out from the wound. Han Jin's hand moved quickly. Then, he pressed his palm down. Countless golden lights floated down and attached themselves to Sunir's wound. One could see with the naked eye that the bleeding was slowing down. Finally, the bright light completely covered the wound. Han Jin heaved a sigh of relief. Among the 6 Ding and 6 Jia arts in the Taoist canon, the former was a spell for curing diseases, while the latter was a charm for killing people. Fortunately, he had enough interest and didn't like to overdo it, so he had learned almost everything. Although he hadn't mastered all of them, at least he had a clear impression of them. Otherwise, he wouldn't know what to do. "Is it done?" Sasu asked softly. "Yes." Han Jin smiled. "Don't worry, sir." An abrupt and hurried voice came from the side. "I beg you, please help our dean." Han Jin turned his head. The one who spoke was Asa. The young magicians all surrounded him. Everyone had an anxious look on their faces, but they did not dare to be rude. Han Jin used that strange magic to kill 2 assassins. Then, he used only 1 blow to kill the Hydra. In their hearts, Han Jin was already an unfathomable powerhouse. Even though Han Jin fainted on the ground because of the exhaustion of magic, this did not affect their respect. If it were their dean, he might not be able to kill a top-tier magical beast in 1 blow. "Raphael, if you can help them," Sasu interrupted. Han Jin did not know what happened. Sasu and Morrison's had already understood the process of the young magician's infighting. They all liked Asa very much. His ability was another matter. At least, Asa was a real man. "Okay." Han Jin nodded. It was reasonable to say that Sasu would not overstep his authority in this kind of matter. There must be a reason, so Han Jin generously agreed. Asa was overjoyed. He glanced at the arrow shaft and walked forward. Unexpectedly, Han Jin did not follow him. Instead, he walked to the other side. The pale-faced Leger was leaning against a wooden pillar. He was lying there on his side, seemingly unconscious. It was not easy to win Han Jin's friendship. For Han Jin, this kind of thing would not change with external factors. No matter how beautiful the face or how prominent the status, it would not change him. Therefore, before treating the young dean, he had to confirm Leger's condition. Leger was very alert. When Han Jin was still 5 or 6 meters away from him, he suddenly opened his eyes. Seeing that it was Han Jin, a look of surprise and joy flashed across his face. He then tried to stand up, but his body stiffened. His eyebrows were almost knitted together. It was obvious that he had pulled on his wound. Han Jin gestured for Leger not to move with his hand. Then, he walked to Leger and put the back of his hand on Leger's neck. Leger smiled weakly. Although his body did not move, his eyes were curiously looking at Han Jin. He was much more perceptive than Morrison's. He could feel that Han Jin had undergone a tremendous change. Leger's pulse was stable and strong. It did not seem like he had any hidden problems. Han Jin bent down again and carefully observed Leger's wound. Although the blood flowing out of Leger's body had dyed half of it red, the wound was not too deep. Han Jin was relieved. "Is Leger okay?" Sasu asked. "He's fine. This guy's body is as strong as a bull." Han Jin smiled. "He's like a bull?" Morrison's curled his lips. No matter if it was his body, weight, or height, he was definitely the first among them. "He's just a calf at most." Leger opened his mouth to retort, but then he realized that he could not speak. If he did, it would hurt his wound. He could only glare at Morrison's fiercely. Under the expectant gazes of the young magicians, Han Jin slowly walked toward Yelena. Because her injuries were too serious, no one dared to move her. She had been lying on a pile of broken branches and leaves since the beginning. At that time, Han Jin had tried his best to save her, but the thief was too fast. The sharp dagger had cut off half of her neck. As for the injury on her back, Han Jin could not see it. Fortunately, the magician's strength was limited, and the dagger did not penetrate her body. If it had been Morrison's, the thief would not have needed to stab her. Under Yelena's body was a pool of dark red blood. God knew how much blood she had lost. The flesh on her neck was a miserable white color. Her beautiful face did not change much. Her brows were slightly furrowed, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was distressed or condemning something. Han Jin also did not dare to move Yelena's body. He grabbed her wrist and listened carefully. Yelena's pulse was extremely weak and intermittent. Han Jin carefully reached out his finger and touched the flesh on her neck. From his fingertips, he could feel a dry feeling. Han Jin was shocked. At this point, Yelena should have been dead. Did you use some kind of magic? Han Jin asked. Yes. Yes, my lord, one of the deacons replied timidly. I brought 2 Holy Spirit blessing scrolls. My lord, the dean can. Asa choked and could not continue. Somehow, they had stopped addressing Han Jin as you, and had tacitly changed it to Your Excellency. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 163. Han Jin pondered for a moment and carefully cast a talisman. The talisman turned into countless golden light spots and landed on the wound on Yelena's neck, but there was no reaction at all. The skin and flesh around the wound were still deathly pale. Despair appeared on the faces of the students. If the dean died, even if they could return to the academy safely, they would have to face a storm. Han Jin stretched out his hand and gently touched the wound. This time, unlike the last time, the flesh around the wound had softened. Han Jin heaved a sigh of relief. His talisman was still effective, but Yelena's injury was too serious. The talisman he could release was far from being able to revive a dead person. It could only improve Yelena's condition bit by bit. In fact, Han Jin knew very well that what Yelena needed most now was a blood transfusion. For a normal person, even if they were not injured, drawing so much blood with a needle would bring them to the brink of death. No matter which world one was in, blood was incomparably important to living beings. Even if Yelena was a supra-level master, she could not escape this law. However, this idea was absolutely not feasible at the moment. Whether their blood types matched was a big problem. Han Jin sighed helplessly. This was somewhat ridiculous. A supra-level master bleeding to death? Sir? How is it? Is there a way? Asa asked eagerly. Han Jin smiled. He did not lack countermeasures. The key was who would bear the risk. Was it worth it to use spiritual energy and release a high-level Taoist spell? Cultivation was about seizing the fortune of heaven and earth and invading the mystery of all things. The word seize and the word invade were enough to prove the essence of cultivation. If one followed it, one would be mortal. If one went against it, one would become an immortal. Cultivation was going against the heavens. Saving Yelena, who was on the brink of death, was just another heaven-defying act. If it was Morrison's or Sassu who were injured, he would have already released the talisman. There was nothing to think about. But now, he had to think clearly about the cause and effect. There is a way, but it is dangerous, Han Jin replied. What kind of danger? What are the chances of success? Asa's eyes lit up when he heard Han Jin say that there was a way. One side is life, the other side is death. The chances of success are about 50%. Han Jin did not tell the truth. In fact, he was at least 70% sure. However, for Yelena to step into the realm of a top-level master at such a young age, in addition to her own talent, she had countless people's blood, sweat, and tears. How could there be no power behind her? So he had to first push the blame. 50% chance of success? Asa was excited. Then what are we waiting for? Sir Dean's injuries are too severe. He might not be able to hold on for much longer. Let's quickly begin. Asa was so excited that he did not realize that his words were simply commanding Han Jin. Morrison's and Sassu frowned and looked at Han Jin worriedly. They had all experienced Han Jin's temper. He was very good to his own people, but if an outsider showed any disrespect, his face would change faster than flipping a book. The chances of success are only 50%. Are you sure you want to start? Han Jin asked again. Let's start. Ace's face showed a trace of determination. The current situation was very clear. If Han Jin did not help, Yelena would definitely die after 3 days when the effect of the blessing of the Holy Spirit wore off. It was better to let Han Jin treat her. At least there was still a 50% chance of success. What do you all think? Han Jin looked at the other magicians. At this time, a few of the quick-witted students reacted, but their reactions were different. Some quietly took a few steps back, while others stood still and pretended to be stupid. However, more people stood beside Asa and said firmly, "Let's start, sir." Okay. Han Jin's tone was short but powerful. He then began to mobilize the spiritual energy in his body. His fingers danced in the air, drawing out a series of obscure runes. The casting time this time was longer than any of Han Jin's previous spells. This was because he was casting a high-grade Taoist spell, the Supreme Soul Sealing spell. Even if the soul of the victim was in a state of dissipation, he had the ability to recover the soul and seal it in the victim's body. Han Jin had just drunk the dragon's blood, and his body was full of energy. That was why he dared to take the risk. If it was before yesterday, he wouldn't even dare to think about it. Perhaps the energy in his body would be exhausted before the charm was formed. After more than half an hour, Han Jin's forehead was sweating. At this time, the spell was finally formed. Han Jin made a hand sign and shouted, "Go!" The condensed talismans in the air were all scattered by the hand sign. They turned into countless light rain and splashed in all directions, sprinkling between the branches and the grass. However, they did not disappear. Instead, they kept rolling and dancing. Ancient trees, shrubs, grasses, and even moss. All the green vegetation withered at a speed that could be seen with the naked eye. Countless light spots continued to dance in the forest, jumping from one branch to another, drilling from one patch of grass to another. Wherever the happy light spots flew to, the living beings there would begin to wither. The range became wider and wider, and in the end, everything within 100 meters became yellow and withered. The Supreme Soul Sealing spell could be said to be the most vivid interpretation of the word seize. For cultivators, except for some rules that they had to abide by, they never had too many scruples. A ginseng spirit that had cultivated for thousands of years already had the ability to communicate with other life forms. Or, it was already a real life. Would a cultivator let it go just because the ginseng spirit had cultivated a magical power? Absolutely not. A wild fox that swallowed and spat out demon cores under the moonlight. Even if it had never done anything bad and just hid in a corner to cultivate, what would a cultivator do if they encountered it? Kill it and seize the demon core. In fact, cultivators were bandits who went against the heavens and earth. They used all means to achieve their dream of immortality. Therefore, they would not be pretentious. They would seize what they should seize and occupy what they should occupy. What's more, completely relying on one's own Jin Yuan to save a dying person would cause a lot of damage to oneself. It was not easy to cultivate to this step, and no one was willing to retreat. Naturally, no one would create a Dao technique that would harm oneself to benefit others. Attracting heavenly lightning, borrowing divine weapons, and so on were all trick. Morrisons and the others stared blankly at the changes in the forest. They could not understand why those soft, warm, and happy light spots were like deadly toxins. Wherever they went, the plants there would quickly wither. Could this kind of magic save people? Han Jin felt that it was about time. He made another hand sign and shouted, "Rise." The hand sign exploded in midair. Countless light spots flew up like birds returning to the forest. They condensed into a huge ball of light and then began to sprinkle down. Han Jin was a very handsome young man. There was almost no fault in his appearance. His smile always gave people a warm feeling, which should be very attractive to girls. Unfortunately, whether it was Chi Li, Sunir, Yen, or Yelena, or the few female sorcerers and deacons, after seeing Han Jin for the first time, they quickly turned their attention to other places. This was because Han Jin's temperament was too weak. In this chaotic world, weak men were not qualified to be the center of attention. Now, Han Jin had become a different person. Although his appearance was the same as before, his eyes opened and closed like lightning, and there was a sharpness that made people not dare to look directly at him. The scale of the magic he was releasing now was huge and imposing. When the countless light spots gathered together, the scene was very spectacular. The light spots sprinkled down one after another. Han Jin stood in the rain of light and kept making hand signs. His long robe fluttered, making him look like an immortal. Not to mention that he was already very handsome, and with the countless light spots as a foil, he looked extremely handsome. The few female sorcerers were so stunned that they almost forgot about the dying Dean. With each drop of light, Yelena's face gained a bit of color. When the rain of light stopped, if it wasn't for the ugly wound on her neck, Yelena would look full of vitality and even healthier than when she wasn't injured. Everyone's expression changed. Looking at the scale of the magic and its effect, some people even thought that Han Jin had released an unknown forbidden spell. But the question was, why couldn't they feel any magic waves? Han Jin sighed softly and bent down again to grab Yelena's wrist. Her pulse was still very weak, but it was much steadier. At least there was a certain rhythm. My lord, how is it?" Asa asked timidly. Although he could see the effect, he still hoped to get a definite and clear answer. "She will wake up by herself tomorrow, but during this time, you have to take care of her carefully. For example, you should move her to a clean place and cover her with more things. The fog in the forest is too heavy at night." "I understand, my lord," Asa replied in a moaning tone. The group of young magicians couldn't help but cheer, and one of them, a deacon, rushed toward Han Jin. Han Jin raised his eyebrows, and his eyes flashed with divine light. The deacon suddenly froze, holding a handkerchief in her hand. She didn't know whether she should continue to walk over or retreat. Han Jin finally understood what she meant. He reached out to take the handkerchief and smiled. "Thank you. Raphael, are you okay?" Sasu asked anxiously. He was now very regretful. If he had known that Han Jin would be forced to release such a large-scale magic, he would not have persuaded Han Jin to save her. Han Jin was just about to say that he was fine, but his tone suddenly changed. "I will be fine after a few days of rest." "Thank you, my lord." "Thank you." Asa bowed deeply to Han Jin. "Thank you so much." The other magicians also bowed to Han Jin, their faces full of gratitude that they didn't know how to express. Han Jin smiled and waved his hand. He felt a little strange. In fact, it felt good to save someone. Chapter 164. In the morning, Sunir woke up from her coma. When she opened her eyes, she saw a familiar silhouette. She couldn't help but think of the heart-wrenching scene. That bright and determined smile, that stubborn and determined figure filled with fighting spirit. Sunir suddenly realized that it would be difficult for anyone else to enter her heart. For some things, meeting the right person was enough. "How are you feeling? Does it still hurt?" Han Jin suddenly turned his head. Although Sunir didn't make any sound, he could still feel the change. Han Jin's voice was a little unclear. His mouth was stuffed with food, and his mouth was covered in oil. He looked a little funny, but no one would laugh. Han Jin's aura had changed drastically. At this moment, his expression was very calm. After all, he was eating and not fighting. However, when Han Jin opened and closed his eyes, Sunir could clearly see a kind of sharpness. In other words, it was a kind of power that was formed by the combination of confidence and strength. This was something that Han Jin had always lacked. It doesn't hurt anymore. Sunir shook her head. Then she tried to open her eyes and looked at Han Jin from head to toe. You're fine? Sunir's voice was full of surprise. This guy is very lucky. How could anything happen to him? Morrison's voice came from outside the straw hut. Before Sunir could say anything, Morrison stuck his head into the straw hut. The key is that I'm here. If I didn't give him so much dragon blood, he probably wouldn't have woken up until now. Is that so? Sunir asked doubtfully. How can you not believe me? Morrison's was anxious. He squeezed into the straw hut. The small space suddenly became crowded with him. If you don't believe me, you can ask Raphael. See if I'm telling the truth. Morrison's was happy that he had saved Han Jin for the whole night. It wasn't easy for him to find a chance to show off, but Sunir still didn't believe him. This made Morrison's very depressed. It's true. Han Jin nodded. He did give me a lot of dragon blood. Sunir looked at Morrison's with a much gentler gaze. She even smiled at Morrison's for the first time. Morrison's was stunned. When Han Jin carried Sunir into the straw hut yesterday, he had already taken off her mask, but Sunir didn't notice it. Now, her smile was so beautiful that even Morrison's, who had a strong immunity to it, was stunned. Sunir suddenly realized that something was wrong. She touched her face, but her face suddenly turned pale. Her wound had been carefully bandaged, and the soft armor on her body was very messy. Obviously, the person who bandaged her wound was not familiar with how to dress a woman. At least, he wasn't familiar with soft armor. Ahem. Han Jin coughed dryly. Morrison's, don't you think it's too crowded here? He saw the change in Sunir's expression and knew that he needed an explanation. It is a little crowded. Morrison's looked up at the straw hut. I should have made this hut bigger yesterday. Han Jin put down the piece of meat helplessly and pointed outside. He admired Morrison's ability to make jokes, but that didn't mean that he had to be patient. Sasu, Raphael asked you to come in. Morrison's shouted at the top of his lungs. There was no other way. No matter if it was an enemy or a friend, they had to be reasonable first. If they couldn't be reasoned with, they could only fight with their fists. It was the same for friends. Han Jin reached out to grab Morrison's, but Morrison's was already on guard against Han Jin. As soon as Han Jin moved, Morrison's moved as well. With a whoosh, he went out of the hut. Han Jin shook his head. He really couldn't understand Morrison's way of thinking. Did he think that he could stay here by pretending to be stupid? My wound. Who bandaged it for me? Sunir asked in a low voice. It was me. Han Jin's expression was very natural. Who else? Just me. Han Jin smiled. There are some things that I won't share with anyone. No one. You. Sunir was embarrassed. Han Jin actually used the word share. It was obvious that he was flirting with her. At this moment, Morrison's voice came from outside. Sunir, you have to take care of him. This guy, after drinking the dragon's blood, his violent tendencies have become more and more serious. What are you guys doing? Sasua's voice interrupted. Morrison's, Raphael called for me? Yes, hurry up and go in. Morrison's replied in a low, muffled voice. In fact, he had a habit. Every time he spoke in a low, muffled voice, his expression would become very honest. Unfortunately, Sasu didn't see through this habit. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. It was obvious that Sasu was walking towards them. Han Jin couldn't help but rub his forehead. He once again had the thought of beating Morrison's up. What could he do? Tell Sasu not to come in? If that was the case, it would only make people's imaginations run wild. Sasua's hand was already on the straw hut when Leger's voice suddenly sounded. If it were me, I wouldn't go in. Ah? Why? Because there are only 2 of them inside. As for who it is, I don't think I need to say it, right? Sasu was stunned for a moment. Were you eavesdropping on their conversation? Sasu. Leger was furious. I was kind enough to warn you. How dare you betray me? Ha ha. You deserve it. Morrison's gloated. Morrison's, you heartless bastard. Sasu was a little embarrassed because he had unintentionally betrayed Leger. He could only vent his anger on Morrison's. Then, a wave of magic appeared. Aya, you still dare to use magic? Morrison's shouted. Han Jin and Sunir looked at each other. After the commotion, all their emotions were gone. Sunir paused for a moment, then changed the topic. The dragon's blood. Is it useful to you? Very useful. Han Jin suddenly sighed. I wanted to store the dragon's blood, but who knew the magic in the dragon's blood has disappeared? Yes. Han Jin nodded. That's common sense. I'll remember it. I won't make the same mistake in the future. Sunir paused. Does that mean the magic crystals? Han Jin whispered. No, the dragon's blood is something between a magic crystal and food. If it was a magic crystal, I would have died a long time ago. Sunir was disappointed. She thought that Han Jin would be able to absorb any magic crystal, but then she became happy again. The dragon's blood contains a lot of energy, right? Of course, it's more than the previous ones combined, Han Jin replied with a smile. Sunir, it seems like you're more anxious than I am. Sunir was angry and embarrassed. She was usually very straightforward, but she had no experience in this kind of thing. She looked at Han Jin with hatred. After a while, she finally said something irrelevant. Can you help me out for a walk? Han Jin thought for a moment and nodded. He released a talisman and put it on Sunir. Then he bent down and hugged Sunir. Sunir was very surprised. She wanted to push Han Jin away, but she also wanted to protect herself. Her white and slender hands were very busy, but Han Jin's movements were very proper. He just gently hugged Sunir, helped her stand, and looked at Sunir with a funny expression. Sunir didn't dare to look at Han Jin. She quietly pointed at the mask on the ground. Han Jin hurriedly picked it up and handed it to Sunir. After putting on the mask, Sunir calmed down a lot. She steadied her breathing and then walked out of the straw hut with Han Jin's help. At this moment, Yelena had also woken up. Her students were excitedly surrounding her and asking about her injuries. Han Jin couldn't help but frown. He helped Sunir walk over and said, "Let her rest for a while. Try not to let her talk." Seeing Han Jin coming over, the magicians immediately made way for him. They all looked at Han Jin with heartfelt gratitude. Han Jin not only saved Yelena but also their lives. If anything happened to Yelena, none of them would have a good ending. Yelena looked at Han Jin with a complicated expression. She had always been high and mighty since she was a child. She had never experienced such a situation. If she had been saved by a supergrade master, she would have felt better, but now she was saved by a few mercenaries she didn't think highly of. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Han Jin bent down and carefully looked at the wound on Yelena's neck. There was a trace of blood around the wound, and it was no longer deathly pale. He then reached out to touch her wrist. Unexpectedly, Yelena moved her arm to the side and stared at Han Jin in surprise. "Dean, Master Raphael has to touch it for a while before casting a spell," Asa hurriedly explained. Han Jin didn't know what to say. This explanation was too ambiguous. Oh? Yelena was stunned. Then, she took the initiative to give her hand to Han Jin. On the one hand, she wasn't a pretentious person. On the other hand, she also wanted to learn about different and novel spells. Ever since she woke up, she had heard too much from the students. She was really curious. Han Jin held Yelena's wrist and listened for a moment. Then, he released a talisman. When the golden light fell on Yelena's body, a bone-deep coolness enveloped her body. "What kind of spell is this?" Yelena stared at Han Jin with her eyes wide open. She could feel that her injury was getting better, and she didn't feel weak anymore. If all of this was caused by Han Jin's spell, then it could only be said that this spell was too amazing. After doing all this, Han Jin supported Sunir and said, "Your injury has stabilized, but try not to move for the next few days. You can leave when your injury is better." Although Han Jin was supporting Sunir, in Yelena's eyes, it was Sunir who was supporting Han Jin. She subconsciously thought that Han Jin had spent a lot of effort to heal her and couldn't even stand properly. "Thank you," Yelena said bitterly after a while, as if she had exhausted all her strength. If the old guys in the capital of elements had heard Yelena's words, they would have been shocked. After all, even the person who gave her the magic wand had never heard of this word. Chapter 165. Human adaptability was very strong. For example, if a person ran to the toilet, he would feel that the smell was bad at first, but after a while, he would find that he could no longer smell anything. This was also a sign of adaptability. In the beginning, young magicians thought that the Terasha Mountains were too scary. They would complain about the slightest trouble. However, after a while, they gradually got used to the life here and mastered many things that they could not learn in school. When a gale wolf appeared in front of you, the first thing to do was not to attack, but to release a defensive magic shield and be careful of your back. Gale wolves would never hunt alone. Their most common trick was to let one wolf attract the attention of the enemy, and the other members of the wolf pack would attack from the back or side. If he was unfortunate enough to encounter a magical beast of the 8th level or above, such as an earthen bear, spiky tiger, and so on, he must not lose his head out of fear. Especially when he was alone, losing his head out of fear would only cause the disaster to descend even faster. Escaping was the only option, but he couldn't just run around. First, he had to control himself, remain silent, face the magical beasts, and slowly retreat. Magical beasts were different from humans. The reason they started killing was to fill their stomach. When they were full, they didn't want to attack anyone, unless the other party invaded their territory or they felt threatened by the other party. If a magical beast pressed on step by step, or even launched an attack, you must not escape into the trees. For a magical beast of the 8th level, no matter how tough and tall the ancient tree was, it could not withstand a single blow. You should release some magic that emitted strong light and loud noise. After all, magical beasts were not as intelligent as humans, so they would have scruples. If it was to protect their territory, they would have no need to continue to attack when you had already begun to retreat. If it was to hunt, they would carefully consider whether it was worth it to be injured for a prey. They instinctively knew that if they wanted to survive in this forest, they had to maintain their full strength. Being injured was extremely dangerous. Also, when you saw something strange, you must control your curiosity. The flower that was more delicate than roses and more fragrant than lilies was actually a poisonous man-eating flower. If something approached it, it would spray out a gray smoke. No matter if it was a human or a magical beast, as long as they breathed in the smoke, they would begin to rot from the inside and eventually turn into a pool of blood. In addition, you must not find a place to rest. There was once a female deacon who was tired and sat on a tree stump. Who knew that the stump was disguised by a half-grown tree demon? If Leger had not discovered it early, even if Yelena could kill the tree demon in an instant, the deacon would have been strangled to death by the tree demon. In short, there were dangers everywhere in the Terasha Mountains. Whether they liked it or not, they had to adapt. Otherwise, they would stay here forever. The young magicians recalled their previous life in the academy. It was like a dream. That evening, they began to get busy again. Because Yelena could not walk, they had stayed here for several days. In this small grassland, they built straw huts of different shapes, just like a barbaric tribe. Anyway, they had nothing to do. With Leger and the others around, there was no need for the young magicians to go hunting. They were full of energy and spent their time building straw hut. When Leger and the others brought back the prey, the female magicians would take over. Although they were a little clumsy, they had many tricks up their sleeve. For Léger, they only needed to roast the prey, but they had to try all kinds of cooking method. Perhaps women were talented in this area. They even found an iron shield from somewhere, washed it clean, and turned it over to use as a big iron pot. At this moment, Han Jean was looking into the distance, lost in thought. Morrison's did not dare to provoke him, but an even bigger light bulb appeared. Somehow, Yelena had become close to Sunir. She always came over and pestered Sunir to tell her stories. Sunir often told her things that she had personally experienced. Yelena, on the other hand, had almost never walked outside since she was a child. Those magnificent stories were fatally attractive to her. "What are you looking at?" Yelena suddenly asked. She followed Han Jin's gaze and saw a cluster of tall, pale dragon bones. She couldn't help but laugh. "Are you still thinking about how to take the dragon bones away? There's no other way. Let's just bury the dragon bones here and make a mark. You can take them the next time you come back." "Why? Do you think we'll leak the secret?" "Of course not." Han Jin smiled. "I'm thinking about something else. When they first distributed the loot, Yelena and the others didn't want anything. They gave all the dragon crystals, dragon scales, and dragon horns to Han Jin and the others. Han Jin wanted a fair distribution, but Yelena insisted that Han Jin and the others deserved it. In the end, Han Jin knew that Yelena wanted to express her gratitude, so he accepted everything. A mere dragon bone was not enough for Yelena to do anything. "Then what are you thinking about?" Yelena seemed to be interested not only in Sunir's story, but also in Han Jin. She wanted to get to the bottom of it. "This place is the hinterland of the Terasha Mountains. We've lost the space scroll. If we want to walk out of the forest on foot, it'll probably take a long time. Then let's walk slowly. There's nothing to do when we get back," Yelena said lightly. "You're the dean of the academy," Sunir said. "I'm just an honorary dean. At most, I'm an honorary dean." "Honorary dean? Then how do you bring students out for training?" Sunir asked. She had been holding this question in her heart for a few days, but they weren't that close before, so she didn't dare to ask. "At first, I didn't know either." Yelena sighed with melancholy. "Now I understand. It's because someone wants me dead." Han Jin and Sunir looked at each other. If Yelena wanted to talk, she would continue. If she didn't want to talk, it was useless for them to continue. "Forget it, let's not talk about this." Yelena shook her head vigorously as if she was trying to get rid of something. In the past, she was always as cold as ice because she couldn't stand being harassed. However, after getting familiar with Han Jin and the others, her true nature gradually revealed itself. In fact, she was very easygoing, never pretentious, and never put on a superior attitude. "By the way, I have something to ask you. Can you give me an answer?" she asked. "What is it?" Han Jin asked. "How did you eat all the dragon meat?" Yelena pointed at the tall dragon bone. "Do you know? A few students thought that you were a super-rank holy beast who had cast a transformation spell. They even secretly used magic detection on you." "Me? A super-rank holy beast?" Han Jin pointed at his nose. "Yes." Yelena nodded forcefully. "Who told you to eat so much?" Sunir said gloatingly. "Who said that?" Han Jin was a little annoyed. Others could doubt his ability or his moral character, but it was too much for them to secretly check his breed. "I can't tell you." Yelena smiled. Han Jin was about to say something, but at this moment, the bustling people in the camp all paused and then jumped up. The young magicians had set up countless magic sentries near the camp. As long as someone or a holy beast approached the camp, they would immediately sense it. Morrison's walked in the direction of the alarm with his sword. Léger had already activated his invisibility spell, and everyone in the camp was ready for battle. Only Han Jin and Yelena still looked relaxed. Confidence came from strength. Although she had suffered a few losses after entering the forest, It was only because she was inexperienced. If the same thing happened again, no one would be able to pose a threat to her. Yelena did not doubt the power she had in her hands. A moment later, a soldier strode out of the forest. When he saw Morrison standing there with a giant sword, he was surprised and shouted, "Brother Morrisons, it's me, Saxon of the Reaper mercenary team. Do you remember me?" "It's you." Morrisons also recognized him. "Where are your companions?" "They are elsewhere." The soldier took a few steps and locked his eyes on Yelena in the distance. However, he did not go past Morrisons and shouted, "Excuse me, are you Dean Yelena?" Yelena was stunned for a moment and nodded slightly. The soldier named Saxon heaved a long sigh of relief. "I finally found you." After saying that, he flipped his wrist and a magic scroll flew out. An emerald-green firework flew straight into the sky and exploded. Morrisons was slightly surprised. The smile on his face quickly disappeared and was replaced by a frosty expression. He quietly looked at the soldier and did not say a word. Seeing Morrison's expression change, the soldier named Saxon hurriedly smiled and said, "I'm sorry, I was too anxious and forgot to explain. We returned to Isolated Cliff City 5 days ago and met Mr. Scott of the God's Language Magic Academy. Mr. Scott issued a mission to find Dean Yelena. We happened to have some impression of Dean Yelena. Haha. At least, Dean Yelena's magic staff is the strangest magic staff I have ever seen. So, we accepted this mission." "Dean Scott? Oh my God! Dean Scott came to find us." The young magicians cheered. Han Jean looked at Yelena, and she nodded slightly. She was telling Han Jean that Dean Scott was a friend and not an enemy. Morrison's expression changed very quickly. In the blink of an eye, he put on a cheeky smile again. "Is the reward very high?" "Very high. It can even be said that we rarely accept missions with such a high reward." Saxon smiled and said, "Don't worry, our captain has already tested him. Lord Scott is very worried about Dean Yelena's safety, which is why he offered such a high reward. He means you no harm. Otherwise, no matter how high the reward is, we wouldn't have accepted this mission." Morrisons was stunned and then nodded. "Thank you. You're welcome. This is our principle." Chapter 166. Not long after, the other members of the Reaper mercenary team appeared from all directions. Obviously, they had spread out to search in the forest. Trying to find a person in this vast forest was no different from looking for a needle in a haystack. It could only be said that their luck was extremely good. In addition to the members of the Reaper mercenary team, there was also a white-haired magician. Behind the magician were several warriors, among whom a middle-aged man was the leader. Seeing Yelena, the white-haired magician seemed to have lost his composure, but he tried his best to control himself. His lips trembled, and he couldn't speak for a long time. "Mr. Scott," Yelena said politely. Han Jean was stunned. Didn't Yelena say that it was a friend of hers? Why did her words sound so unapproachable? In fact, Han Jean wasn't very familiar with Yelena. Yelena's attitude towards others was basically the same, including Han Jean in the past. "Miss Yelena, are you okay?" the old man named Scott asked in a trembling voice. "As you can see, I'm very good now," Yelena replied faintly. "No, nothing happened? I'm very lucky." That's good, that's good." Scott nodded hurriedly. Leger and the others looked at each other. They all felt very strange. According to their conversation, the old man named Scott seemed to know that Yelena was going to be assassinated. Yelena's reaction was even stranger. It was Han Jean who saved her, so why didn't she say anything? "That's all for you." Scott waved his hand. "You can go now." The middle-aged warrior took out a piece of paper, made a few lines on it, and then handed it to the mercenaries of the Reaper mercenary team. The leader took it and carefully checked it. Then he whistled loudly and said to Morrisons with a smile, "Morrisons, we owe you a lot this time. When you return to isolated Cliff City, don't forget the promise you made a few days ago." Saxon of the Reaper mercenary team added, "Yes, you must come to us. Otherwise, I'll take it that you're afraid." "Don't worry, Winston. It's impossible for me to blame you for the wine." The president of Morrison's University laughed. The leading warrior smiled and nodded to Han Jin and the others, then led the members into the forest. "And you guys, no matter what your mission was, you've completed it. Hurry up and leave." The middle-aged warrior's gaze landed on Morrison's. Leger, Morrison's, and the others were stunned by the rude tone. They all looked at Han Jin. Han Jin was now the absolute center of their group. He was irreplaceable. Before they made any response, they had to understand Han Jin's attitude. Han Jin didn't say a word. He just looked at his palm quietly, as if a flower had grown on it. "Harry, who are you talking to? They're my friends." Yelena scolded harshly. The middle-aged warrior named Harry stiffened. His face looked very awkward. It seemed that he was usually a high and mighty figure. He was rarely reprimanded by others. Therefore, he felt a little embarrassed. People like him didn't care about how others felt when they reprimanded others. "Harry, why don't you apologize?" Scott's face darkened. Harry's face turned red. After a moment, he gritted his teeth, bent down, and whispered, "I'm sorry, I was too rude." Unfortunately, no one paid any attention to him. Some looked at the sky, some yawned, while Han Jin continued to admire the invisible flower. Harry's eyes flashed, but he restrained his emotions and bowed his head. "Excuse me," Scott said pleasantly. "I have something to discuss with Miss Yelena. Can you leave us alone for a moment?" Sasu saw that Han Jin's but was rooted to the ground and didn't move. He understood Han Jin's attitude, so he smiled and said, "I'm sorry, this is our camp. If you have something to discuss and it's not convenient for others to hear, you can go somewhere else." Scott was stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. He had been rejected? The vice dean of the God's Language Magic Academy was rejected by a few small mercenaries? It didn't matter whether what Scott said made sense or not. The relationship between Han Jin and the others had been evolving little by little. They went from being congenial to being close friends, from taking care of each other to being valued, from being valued to being respected, from being respected to being worshipped. Who could turn the tide and knock down the assassins who posed a fatal threat to them? Who could kill the Hydra in one fell swoop? None of them could do it. They could only rely on one person. Moreover, although they didn't know Han Jin's secret, the Happy Sunir had told them that Han Jin was much stronger than before. Han Jin could do these unimaginable things in the past, but what about now? Therefore, Sasu was very confident. As long as Han Jin was there, he or they would not be afraid of any challenge. The Reaper mercenary team, which had already walked to the edge of the forest, sensed that the atmosphere was not right, so they stopped and watched quietly. "Mr. Scott, if you have anything to say, you can say it here," Yelena said slowly. "They are all my friends and I trust them." Scott's eyes swept over Leger and the others, as if he wanted to remember their faces. Finally, he turned his eyes to Yelena, hesitated for a moment, and whispered, "Miss Yelena, come back with us." "Go back?" Yelena's tone suddenly became sharp. "Mr. Scott, don't you think you should give me an explanation first?" "Miss Yelena, the Duke is very anxious." "He has been, Mr. Scott. What I need is an explanation, not someone's emotions." Yelena's tone became cold, and she interrupted Scott. "Miss, come back with me first, and then we can talk, okay?" Scott said in an almost pleading tone. Perhaps Yelena had never seen Scott like this before, so she was a little surprised. After a while, she said softly, "What about Edison? How is he?" "Miss, you should also know how violent Edison's temper is. If he finds out about this, he'll definitely cause a storm of blood. So, the Duke is afraid that he will cause trouble, so he has put him under house arrest." Scott said with a bitter smile. Irritable? You mean honest? That's funny. Yelena laughed. The guy who instigated the murder was not punished at all. Just because of what Edison might do, he was put under house arrest. The great Duke, you are too kind. Hearing this, the young magicians were all shocked. They were inexperienced, but it didn't mean that they were all fools. Although Yelena didn't say the name of the person, they all knew who she was talking about and what she was referring to. Miss, let's go back and talk about it, okay? Scott was obviously begging. If you are still afraid, please don't worry. As long as I am here, I will never allow anyone to. I can protect myself. Yelena interrupted Scott again. Dean Scott, please go back and tell him that he has learned the Duke's benevolence. I congratulate him, sincerely congratulate him. My lady. Scott's expression changed drastically. Yelena's words were like a dagger to his heart. Who wants me to die the most? Yelena smiled. It's Forza from Fado City. For the sake of his own ideals, he can endure humiliation and even stand on the same side as the enemy. I don't know how to describe him anymore, but I can guarantee that he will become an incomparably powerful lord in the future, right? Mr. Scott, I used to have a puppy. Do you remember? Scott broke out in a cold sweat. Seeing that Yelena suddenly changed the topic, he thought that there was a turning point. He hurriedly said with a smile, of course, the puppy was very cute, but unfortunately, it was killed by a carriage. Yelena's eyes flashed with sadness. Why was the puppy so cute? Because it was cute and wouldn't hurt anyone. People liked to tease it when they saw it, but would anyone be willing to tease a mad dog? In fact, the reason is the same. For ordinary dogs, a mad dog is a horrible existence. For people, a madman is equally horrible. So I think he will definitely become an extremely powerful lord. Am I right? Scott's expression changed again and again. These words were not for him or the students to listen to. He couldn't imagine what would happen if the he in Yelena's words were known to him. Miss, you should talk to the Duke about this. Scott smiled bitterly. I won't go back. Yelena shook her head. Why? Scott was shocked. Because it makes me sick, Yelena said calmly. If you want to go back, you can go with Mr. Scott, Yelena said faintly. The young magicians looked at each other and then began to shake their heads vigorously. They couldn't get involved in this kind of thing. If they got involved, it might bring about a fatal disaster. The problem was, could they still get out of it now? Miss, I said, I won't go back. Yelena said in a resolute tone. Scott sighed. Miss, in fact, the Duke has already guessed it, so he asked me to bring you a letter. Then he handed a letter to the middle-aged warrior named Harry. Harry took the letter and walked respectfully to Yelena. Then he presented the letter to her. Yelena picked up the letter, hesitated for a moment, and gently tore the envelope open. As the crack on the envelope expanded, a very light yellow smoke rose. Yelena was shocked and hurriedly held her breath. But she still breathed in some of the smoke. Then she became a little unstable and staggered. Bastard! Morrison's roared and swung his giant sword at Harry's back. Harry's expression didn't change. He pulled out his long sword and twisted his body to block Morrison's attack. The combat energy he released was much brighter than Morrison's. When the two swords collided, it was obvious who had the upper hand. Morrison's giant sword was suddenly rebounded, leaving Morrison's chest wide open. At the same time, Harry reached out his left hand to support Yelena's slender waist. In fact, Morrison's strength shouldn't have been so weak. However, he attacked in a hurry, while Harry was well prepared. In addition, there was a huge gap between their strength, so there was no doubt that he was defeated in an instant. Han Jin, who had been silent all this time, suddenly moved. His fingers flicked very quickly. Morrison's retreated 7 or 8 steps before he could stabilize himself. The leather armor in front of his chest had been split open, revealing the bloody flesh inside. However, the wound wasn't deep. Han Jin had blessed him with spirit possession in time, so his skin was much tougher than armor. Moreover, he also had combat energy to protect himself. Harry didn't even think highly of him and didn't even bother to use his full strength. This was a blessing in disguise. The magic staff in Yelena's hand suddenly lit up, and an invisible wave of magic spread out in all directions with her body as the center. Magic resistance. The first thing that was bounced off was Harry's hand, then his body. His expression changed greatly, and before he could react, a turbulent electric light had enveloped his body. Harry flew backward like a cannonball for more than 20 meters. He staggered a dozen steps back and almost bumped into Scott. "You. Good," Yelena said, gnashing her teeth. Her face was pale with anger, and her hand holding the wand was trembling slightly. "Miss, we mean no harm." Scott's face was full of bitterness. He didn't expect the plan to fail, and he couldn't think of a reason for it. "The Duke has ordered us to take you back." "Get out. Get out of here," Yelena screamed. "Miss," Yelena slowly raised her wand. Scott sighed and said helplessly, "Harry, let's go." Harry's face became livid. The mission was not completed. He couldn't explain it when he went back, and he had offended Yelena. Today was the most miserable day of his life. Force. They didn't even dare to think about it. Yelena was a genius, and her strength was second only to the chief dean of the Magic Academy. This was also the reason why Forza of Fato City was determined to get rid of Yelena. Everyone knew that Yelena was bound to become a great magus. This was the supreme existence between heaven and earth, and she could compete with any tyrannical life. Even if they joined forces, they might not be able to gain the upper hand. What's more, if Yelena lost a strand of hair in the confrontation, they couldn't explain it when they went back. "Get out!" Yelena screamed angrily again. Scott and Harry looked at each other and stepped back angrily. They knew that there was no hope. "Wait a minute." Han Jin stood up slowly, tidied up his robe, and then turned his eyes to Scott and Harry. Han Jin released the Supreme Soul Sealing spell, and no one could feel any power fluctuations. Except for Morrison's and Yelena, no one knew what Han Jin had just done. As for Scott and Harry, they simply ignored Han Jin. "What?" Harry asked coldly. "You hurt my people and now you want to leave?" Han Jin smiled and looked very friendly, but his words were full of murderous intent. "No, absolutely not. What do you want?" Harry looked Han Jin up and down with a mocking look. He had been suppressing his anger, and this mercenary's provocation was exactly what he wanted. "I don't like to be taken advantage of. For example, if someone hurts my hand, I'll cut off one of his fingers. If someone cuts off one of my fingers, I'll cut off one of his hands." Han Jin said indifferently, "Do you understand? My hand is here." Harry raised his hand and shook it, his face full of undisguised sarcasm. "Raphael, Yelena said hurriedly. "I'm not talking to you." Yelena was stunned and closed her mouth with a wry smile. Scott and Harry's expressions changed at the same time. Yelena was arrogant because of her talent and looked down on ordinary people. In their memory, they had never seen anyone talk to her in such a tone. What was more shocking was that Yelena tolerated it. This was simply unimaginable. "Damn it. You're just a little 9th-level swordsman. Do you think you're strong?" Morrison sneered. This guy had always been a loser. Although he had just lost, he could not be discouraged. Besides, he knew that Han Jin would definitely avenge him. "Your Excellency, I apologize for the behavior of my companions." Scott's face was solemn. Just now, Yelena seemed to want to intercede for them, and the injured mercenary's tone was very arrogant. Obviously, the opponent in front of them had unfathomable strength. "It's too late." Han Jin smiled, and then his fingers moved briskly. Without any magic fluctuation, a small fireball appeared in his hand. Then Han Jin flicked his finger, and the fireball flew out lightly toward Harry. Scott and Harry stared at the fireball nervously. They had never seen this kind of magic before. The attack speed was too slow, and it kept floating in the air. How could it hit the opponent? But at this moment they did not dare to underestimate Han Jin, so they could only prepare with full concentration. No matter how slow the fireball flew, there was always a time when it would arrive. Harry's whole body was shrouded in a dazzling white light. He had already released his Do Chi to the extreme. Then he waved his long sword and slashed at the fireball. Unexpectedly, the fireball was disrupted, but it did not disperse. It attached to Harry's long sword, turning it into a burning sword in an instant. Harry was stunned. He waved his long sword with all his strength, trying to get rid of the flame. But the flame was very tenacious. Not only did it not go out, but it also burned along the long sword. This long sword had been with Harry for many years, and it had irreplaceable value and significance. Harry did not want to abandon his long sword, but he had no other choice. He had to let go of his sword when the flame had reached the hilt. Unfortunately, Harry was one step too late. A little spark rolled up and fell on the back of his hand. No one, including Harry, would pay attention to a little spark. Unexpectedly, that little spark turned into a raging flame, completely enveloping Harry's entire right hand. Han Jin sneered. With his current strength, the 3 true fire released by him had many shortcomings that could not be remedied. For example, it was slow and had a short range. If Harry did not come into contact with the flame and kept retreating, Han Jin would have no choice but to choose other offensive Taoist magic arts. But Harry dared to attack with his sword, so everything was settled. Harry screamed and waved his right hand desperately. But he could not get rid of the flame just now, let alone now. Scott hurriedly released a water arrow, which hit Harry's right hand. But the flame was not affected at all, and it was still burning. Scott was really anxious. He raised the magic wand in his hand, and a cloud of mist gathered on Harry's right hand. Immediately, the mist formed a solid block of ice and sealed Harry's hand in it. A shocking scene appeared in front of everyone. The flame was burning unscrupulously in the ice block. The dancing flame was extremely strange, which had subverted the common sense of magic. Was the ice block just an illusion? Or was the flame illusory? Harry finally could not bear it anymore. He knelt down on the ground and desperately swung his right hand, hitting it on the ground. Boom! Boom! The ice block could not bear the impact. After several hits, it turned into ice chips. Then, with a roar, Harry deeply inserted his right hand into the ground. No one could see what happened underground, but they could see Harry's reaction. His remaining hand was desperately digging, grabbing clumps of turf, and then banging his head on the ground. His body sometimes curled up like a poor shrimp, sometimes twitching violently like a lamb being slaughtered, sometimes bouncing up and kicking up mud and sand like a frightened wild horse. Seeing all this, everyone felt a chill in their hearts. Could it be that the fire had not been extinguished yet? Harry suddenly pulled his hand out and raised it in front of his face. At this moment, his hand had become a mass of charred black, and the flames were still burning fiercely. No one could withstand this kind of torture, no matter how strong a person was. His cry was filled with despair and fear. Harry hit the ground with his hand like a madman, but no matter what he did, the flame was still burning on his hand. Fire God's flame. Scott's pupils suddenly shrank, and then he felt something was wrong. Fire God's flame was a super-level forbidden spell, which had a very large attack range. However, the magic released by Harry did not have a large attack range at all. It was just close to the property of Fire God's flame. Cut off his hand! Scott shouted. What? Harry's men snapped out of their stupor. Bastard! Cut off his hand! Scott's veins on his forehead jumped. One of the soldiers bravely walked to Harry's side. When Harry pulled his hand out again, he seized the opportunity and slashed down with his sword. Harry's wrist was cut off, but the strange flame attached to the warrior's sword. The warrior suddenly let out an inhuman scream and threw the sword out without hesitation. After seeing what had happened to Harry, they were so scared that they couldn't bear any more fright. Harry fell to the ground. After a while, he suddenly screamed in despair again. A few sparks spurted out from his broken arm, and then turned into a burning flame. "Your Excellency!" Scott stared at Han Jin, and his white beard shook like waves. "How could you release such a vicious magic? Isn't it too much?" This time, he addressed Han Jin respectfully, but as Han Jin said, it was a little too late. If he had talked to Han Jin politely earlier, if Harry hadn't fought back, and if he had confessed the relationship between the Duke of the Capital of Elements and Yelena, Han Jin wouldn't have stopped him. After all, it was someone else's family business. Being arrogant first and then being respectful usually wouldn't lead to any good result. That was because arrogance was real, it was an expression of one's nature, but respect was fake, it was an attitude that one had no choice but to show when one's strength was inferior. If I hadn't released the magic in time, my companion would have been killed by you. Han Jin smiled. You didn't give him a chance, so why should I give you a chance? Scott was speechless. Neither he nor Harry had taken these mercenaries seriously, so it was natural for them to be ruthless. Now, there was no point in regretting it. After struggling for a long time, Harry had exhausted all his strength. He collapsed on the grass, waving his burning arm wildly. He let out a weak wail, looking like he was on the verge of death. "Miss," Scott said in a sad voice. Yelena didn't hear Scott's pleas. She stared at the burning flame with fanaticism in her eyes. Talent was another thing. She had surpassed most sorcerers at such a young age, and that was her love for magic. Seeing it with her own eyes was far more shocking than hearing it from others. Finally, Harry's head tilted and he passed out. The burning flame gradually dimmed and finally went out quietly. Scott's eyes flickered. People were so strange. The younger they were, the more fearless they were, and the older they were, the more they cherished their lives. He really didn't dare to fight against a mysterious sorcerer. Moreover, Yelena wouldn't help him. Harry had lost all his combat power, and he couldn't rely on his subordinates. He was alone, and there were several mercenaries in front of him. Scott finally found an excuse for himself. He glared at Han Jin and said word by word, "You will regret what you did today. That's for the future." Han Jin smiled. "If you say a few more words, I promise you will regret it now." Sasu and the others burst into laughter. Even Morrison's endured the pain and laughed. Scott turned around abruptly and walked into the forest. Just then, something jumped into his eyes and he was stunned. Hundreds of meters away, there was a tall dragon skeleton. As the deputy dean of the Magic Academy, he certainly knew what it was. When he came here, he was so focused on persuading Yelena that he didn't have the time to observe the surroundings. Now, he couldn't help but shudder. A dragon slayer. A Grand Magus might not be able to become a dragon slayer, but it was only because they had the ability to fight against a dragon. The strength of the supreme professions was not equal, and there were still differences between them. A dragon slayer was one of the few elites among the supreme professions. Scott couldn't tell from the skeleton that it was just an underage dragon. Of course, he didn't think that Yelena had the ability to slay a dragon. Thinking of Yelena's attitude towards Han Jin, he blamed this mess on Han Jin. Scott suddenly felt that the scene in front of him was a bit blurry. It was too ridiculous to try to take revenge on a dragon slayer. Even if he had enough courage, who would do it with him? The Duke in the Capital of Elements would never offend a dragon slayer for anyone, would he? Scott's mood change was so obvious that it attracted the attention of the Reaper mercenary team. They looked in the same direction and saw the dragon skeleton at the same time. Their faces all changed. They had seen the magic released by Han Jin from the beginning to the end. Two of the sorcerers in the team had the same opinion as Scott. It was the power of the fire god's flame. However, they had some doubts. How could such a young man release a supreme forbidden spell without chanting a spell? Now that the dragon skeleton had solved all their doubts, there was no point in doubting. The dragon skeleton was the most powerful evidence. Scott and the others carried the unconscious Harry and disappeared into the forest. Han Jin's eyes fell on Morrison's. He whispered, "How is it? Does it hurt?" "It doesn't hurt." Morrison straightened his chest and replied. He felt very comfortable. Although the magic was a bit vicious, Han Jin was avenging him. "Then let's talk about it tomorrow." "Ah." Morrison's face immediately turned bitter. "Idiot." Sassu sneered. "Why don't you just admit that it hurts?" Morrison's turned around angrily and glared at Sassu. At this moment, the warrior named Saxon from the Reaper mercenary team hurried over, while the other members all hid in the dense forest. "Morrison's, how is your wound?" Saxon asked. "It's nothing. It's just a small wound." Moxink was about to admit his mistake to Han Jin, but when he saw Saxon asking him, he immediately changed his mind. It was still the same old saying, lose the battle but not lose the dignity. "That's good." Saxon paused as an embarrassed expression appeared on his face. He then bowed deeply to Han Jin and slowly said, "Captain Winston asked me to express his apologies. We were too gullible and brought you trouble. This time we owe you. If you need any help in the future, please do not hesitate to let us know. We will not refuse." "You are too kind." "This is nothing," Han Jin said softly. "Perhaps it is nothing to you, sir, but to us." Saxon smiled bitterly and then said seriously, "Captain Winston's message has been delivered. Friends, let's meet in isolated Cliff City." After that, Saxon turned around and chased after his companions. "This guy is interesting," Sassu whispered as he watched Saxon's back. "I'm a bit tired." Han Jin yawned. "I'm going to rest for a while." "Are you serious? Raphael, you really don't care about me?" Morrison's hurriedly chased after him with a sad face. Chapter 167. One after another, fat forest-devouring rats sneakily crawled out from the ground and rushed toward the Hydra's corpse. A dragon's body was full of treasures, but a Hydra of similar rank couldn't be compared to a dragon. Other than a rare poisonous magic crystal, it had almost nothing. Han Jin didn't believe in superstition and had studied it carefully. Later, he found that the skin and meat of the Hydra were poisonous. If the poison was strong enough to cause damage in a short period of time, then Han Jin would find a use for it and could make some toys. If the poison was weak, then Han Jin would turn the Hydra into energy that he needed. Unfortunately, the Hydra's poison was neither strong nor weak, which was awkward because it could neither be eaten nor used. The others weren't interested in the Hydra either. In the end, the young magicians simply thought of a way to move the Hydra's corpse far away. But to the forest rats, the Hydra's huge body was a treasure. They would always come out in groups at fixed times to feed. As usual, the sound of gnawing could be heard. Everyone was already used to it and went about what they were doing. Suddenly, Yelena, who was sitting quietly on the side, frowned. She raised her magic wand, and a violent bolt of lightning fell from the sky and hit the Hydra's corpse. In the deafening boom, the Hydra's rotten flesh burst out like raindrops, mixed with countless forest rats. Seeing this, Morrison's couldn't help but shrink his neck and whisper, "Sassu, sing us a song." As a bard, Sassu should be proficient in singing and reciting, but his singing wasn't very pleasant, and because of this, he was often ridiculed by Morrison's. However, Morrison's suddenly asked Sassu to sing for them. His intention was very bad and could even be described as vicious. "Sing." Sassu was stunned. Driven by his professional instinct, he coughed a few times and asked, "What do you want to hear? The story of Abraham?" "Sassu, do you want to be struck by lightning?" Leger sighed. In fact, Sassu was a very smart person. However, he would never guard against his companions. That damned Morrisons, on the other hand, were always looking for opportunities to play tricks on people. In comparison, Sassu suffered the most. Morrisons was not ashamed that his scheme had been exposed. Instead, he was proud of it and shook his head proudly. Sassu was so angry that his face turned red. This was an insult. He had actually compared his own singing to the noises of the forest rats. She's in a bad mood. Sunir looked at Yelena's side profile. Ha-ha, anyone with eyes can see that. Morrisons was so pleased with himself that he began to mock Sunir again. Sunir turned to look at Morrisons, sizing up Morrisons. No, that's not what I meant. Morrisons suddenly realized that something was wrong. He scratched his head and explained, I mean everyone knows that you don't have to, Sunir, he's deliberately provoking you. Sassu said indignantly. I understand. Sunir nodded. Ha! Raphael, oh my God, look what you've found! Morrison stared behind Sunir and the others and yelled. Sunir, Leger, and Sassu did not turn around. Their eyes were fixed on Morrison's, and their expressions were almost the same. Raphael, you're so lucky! Morrisons yelled again. The situation was still the same. The three of them were staring at Morrisons as if they were looking at a monster. No, no! Morrisons suddenly looked terrified. Don't point that thing at Sunir, it's dangerous. Sunir bit her lips lightly, Leger lowered his head in pain, and Sassu had a gloating look on his face. It was not that Morrison's acting was bad. Han Jean was walking over from behind Morrison's. No matter how good Morrison's acting was, he could not fool anyone. Raphael, don't. Morrison's almost shouted himself hoarse in order to escape safely. Han Jean patted Morrison's on the shoulder and asked suspiciously, What are you doing? It was no wonder that he was surprised. Morrison's was looking in another direction and shouting his name, but there was nothing there. Morrison's suddenly froze and his anxious shouting stopped. Sassu and Leger could no longer control themselves and laughed loudly. Even Sunir covered her mouth with the back of her hand and giggled. That's not right. Moxink still refused to admit defeat. I clearly saw you over there just now. It was an illusion. It must be an illusion. Go away. Leger laughed and kicked Morrison's. You're so shameless. Morrison's, of course, did not get kicked. He turned around and laughed awkwardly. What happened just now? Han Jean asked softly. He had been staying in the forest for half a day. Now that he had miraculously achieved great success in alchemy, he had a lot more choices to make. Therefore, he needed a relatively quiet place to think carefully about what he had to do as soon as possible and what he could do later. This was very important to him. When he faced all kinds of dangers in the future, the choices he made now would determine his life and death. Hearing a loud noise from the camp, Han Jean rushed back as fast as he could. He was relieved to see that there was nothing wrong with the people in the camp, but he did not know what had happened. The forest rats came out to eat again. Then, someone in a bad mood raised her magic wand. Then, boom! The world became quiet, Leger said with a smile. Oh! Han Jean looked at Yelena. We should go. Maybe she'll feel better if we continue to adventure in the forest. Han Jean could understand Yelena's feelings. It was normal to be assassinated, and Yelena must have understood the cause and effect. However, she couldn't tolerate the fact that the mastermind behind her wasn't punished at all. No one would be able to accept this. Sunir's injuries are not healed yet, Sassu said. Yes, I was injured yesterday. Moxink chimed in, unwilling to be left out. Han Jean turned his gaze to Sunir. As for Morrison's, he had already been ignored. Sunir moved her arms. I can walk, but I can't fight. Raphael, I think we should rest for a few more days, Leger said. That's the only way. Han Jean paused. We forgot something yesterday. What is it? Sunir asked. We should talk to the Reaper mercenary team and ask them to send us a space scroll. We can pay several times the price. I think Yelena and the others won't care. On the contrary, they'll be very happy. Yes. Sasu and the others shouted in unison. For the Reaper mercenary team, this was not a big deal. They could go back with a space scroll, buy 2 more, and find Han Jin and the others again. They were just running errands. Besides, they felt guilty and would not find an excuse to refuse. Why didn't you say that yesterday? Morrison's muttered. With a space scroll, they could go back whenever they wanted. At least they would feel more comfortable. I just thought of it. I'll go and talk to her, Sunir said slowly. Sunir, you'd better not go, Leger said. That Yelena is very arrogant. What if she doesn't appreciate it at all? She won't. I'll go easy on her. Sunir smiled and walked towards Yelena. Leger shrugged. In fact, his personality was very similar to Han Jin. Han Jin would not be moved by someone's appearance, and neither would he. Therefore, he only cared about whether Sunir would be wronged. Yelena's sadness had nothing to do with him. Sunir was already talking to Yelena. Although she was in a bad mood, Yelena forced a smile and chatted with Sunir. Leger saw that what he was worried about did not happen, so he looked away. Raphael, what did you do? Why did you take so long? There are some things that I need to think about carefully. What is it? Maybe I can give you a good suggestion. Leger asked tentatively. You can't give me any suggestions. Han Jin laughed. However, he did not want to disappoint Leger, so he decided to reveal some information. I can release some new spells. However, my spells are a bit special and require a long time to prepare. Therefore, I can only choose a few spells and give up on the rest. That day, the spell you used to kill the Hydra, you were able to release it a long time ago? Yes. Han Jin said, in the past, I didn't have enough magical power. That kind of spell would bring me fatal danger. Now, I can't release it easily, unless it's a last resort. Leger and Morrisons nodded. They saw how Han Jin changed after releasing the spell and knew that Han Jin was telling the truth. Sasu suddenly said, Magical power. But I don't feel that you have any magical power. That's because my training method is different from yours. Han Jin could only explain it this way. When it came to Han Jin's core secrets, Sasu and the others tacitly stopped asking questions. Leger said, What about the spell you released yesterday? Was it the fire god's flame? Can you release a spell of a higher level than that? It's not the fire god's flame. Han Jin paused. I should be able to. Leger and the others looked at each other. Han Jin's speed of advancement was shocking and gave them a great shock. A small fireball could destroy a 9th-grade swordsman. Then, what kind of power would Han Jin have if he released a higher-level spell? I'm going to meditate. Sasu threw out a sentence out of nowhere and walked towards his straw hut. I think we should all work hard, Leger said with a bitter smile. Chapter 168. After resting for more than 10 days, Sunir and Yelena's injuries were almost healed. No matter how harmonious life in the camp was, it was time to set off. At least they had to get out of the Terasha Mountains, and they couldn't keep circling around in the forest of magic beasts. Han Jin and the others moved the dragon bones to another place, dug a deep hole, and buried the dragon bones. Although Han Jin and Sunir's space rings were of good quality, compared to their recent harvest, it was very limited. The stacked dragon scales had taken up a lot of space, and there were also the dragon horns that were more than a meter tall and the dragon tendons that were pulled out. From a cost-performance perspective, they could only keep the dragon bones. Han Jin had thought of throwing away the dryad, but the space the dryad made could only hold a few bones at most, and the dragon bones were of no use to him for the time being. The wooden puppets made by the dryad could be of great help to him at critical times, such as saving people or trapping enemies, so he gave up in the end. Morrison's was distressed because they didn't know when they would be able to come back, and even if they did, they might not be able to take the dragon bones out. The battle between the Hydra and the dragon had given them a great advantage. This kind of thing was extremely rare, and perhaps it would only happen once in a lifetime. The flesh attached to the dragon bones had begun to rot, and the smell was terrible. However, Morrison's didn't care about others' objections and forcibly cut off a section of the tailbone. He was determined to take it with him no matter what. After a busy day, they were finally ready. Early the next morning, they left the camp. Gold coins were equivalent to the exchange of items, but in fact, there was another thing that was far above gold coins, and that was time. As long as one worked hard, time could be exchanged for everything, including money. Therefore, young people shouldn't be underestimated. Although they had no experience, no capital, and weak willpower, and were easily discouraged by setbacks, no one could predict their future development because they had enough time. After this period of training, the former rookies had matured at a rapid rate. Once again, they were moving through the forest, and they were less resentful. Even if someone accidentally fell into a quagmire or was accidentally scratched by a branch, they would no longer curse or worry like before. These small setbacks were completely bearable. Surprisingly, the nearby forest had inexplicably become a popular area. During the first 3 days of walking in the forest, they didn't encounter anything. On the 4th day, they met a mercenary team of 7 people, and on the 5th day, they met 3 groups of mercenaries, including a mercenary group with more than 30 people. However, Han Jin and the others didn't interact with the other mercenaries, and the 2 groups always passed by each other. One evening, Morrison's found a relatively clean place to rest. Suddenly, Yelena walked over to Han Jin and sat down next to Han Jin. Although they could trust each other, they were still far from being so intimate. Morrison's and the others were stunned, and even Sunir's eyes widened. However, Yelena said something that immediately dispelled everyone's doubts. "If a thief is wandering around us, is he our enemy?" Yelena said in a very low voice. "Thief? You mean there's a thief around us?" Leger said with a smile. His face was like a spring breeze, as if he was talking about something warm in the past. None of them, including Morrison's, who was known as the dumbest, glanced around randomly. "Yes." Yelena nodded. "I didn't expect you to be the first to discover it." Han Jin smiled at Yelena. Perhaps it was because they were too close that Han Jin's breath blew on her face, or perhaps it was because of the hidden meaning in his words, but Yelena's face turned a little red. Professionals like thieves were rather wretched, and they usually posed different kinds of threats to other professionals, especially to mages. They were known as the nemesis of mages. Thieves would always sneak up on their targets and attack suddenly. Mages' defensive abilities and reaction speed couldn't be compared to warriors, and if they weren't careful, they would be ambushed. However, the arrogant Yelena had fallen into the hands of thieves twice in a short period of time, which was an unbearable humiliation for her. Learning from this painful experience, Yelena developed a habit. When eating, chatting, walking, daydreaming, and even when she woke up in the middle of the night, she would regularly release magic detection as if it was a conditioned reflex to look for possible enemies. It was somewhat of a panic attack, but Yelena insisted on it, and she would use an almost extreme attitude to carry out this habit to the end. In the forest of magic beasts, no one is allowed to secretly observe others. "This is a rule," Leger said softly. "If the rule is broken, it will be a signal for battle." "I understand." Yelena clenched her wand. "Don't worry, Yelena. Look at me." Han Jin said slowly. "Yes, just like that. Don't move. Do you know where the thief is now?" "Yes." "Tell us where he is." "On my left, about 40 meters away." "You can see what the thief looks like?" Morrison's asked curiously. "No, I can only see a blurry shadow." "Great." Han Jin laughed. "Now you just need to control him and make sure he can't move. Leave the rest to us." Yelena looked at Han Jin quietly. The wand in her hand suddenly flashed, and a circle of shining ice flashed across the grass. The thief was secretly observing Han Jin and the others, and he didn't expect his whereabouts to be exposed. In an instant, the ice fog had frozen, and the thief's body was wrapped in a thin layer of ice. Sunir twisted her slender waist and pulled back her longbow. A black arrow shot out like lightning. The thief had just broken through the ice when the arrow pierced through his thigh. The thief screamed and fell to the ground involuntarily. Then, he struggled to crawl into the forest. This confirmed Leger's judgment. It was because he had bad intentions that he tried to escape. As soon as the thief crawled 7 or 8 meters away, Moxink arrived and kicked the thief's waist with a flying kick. The thief's reaction was fast, and his movements were fierce. He rolled over to avoid Morrison's kick, raised his dagger, and stabbed toward Morrison's thigh like lightning. Under normal circumstances, thieves would target the throat, heart, and other body parts. However, the thief was half lying on the ground, while Morrison's was standing. Besides, Morrison's was tall and burly, so attacking the thigh was the thief's limit. Morrison's retreated quickly. With a roar, he swung his sword toward the thief's head. The thief didn't care about Morrison's sword at all. He pushed off the ground with his left hand and threw himself at Morrison's, stabbing his dagger toward Morrison's abdomen. It was a suicidal tactic. Morrison's university was furious. He had been under a lot of pressure because of Han Jin's speed of advancement. He had been training hard for the past few days. Now that he found it difficult to deal with a half-crippled thief, wouldn't he be a laughingstock? However, the thief didn't care about his own life. His movements were swift and fierce, while Morrison's university had to keep him alive. His hands were tied, and he was forced to retreat. At this moment, a figure appeared out of nowhere. A cold light flashed in his hand, and a dagger pierced through the thief's ankle, nailing him to the ground. The thief groaned. His attack speed was slowed by half a beat. Morrison's university seized the opportunity and swung his greatsword upward, knocking the thief's dagger away. Morrison's university then stomped on the thief's face. Morrison's university's foot was a little bigger, while the thief's face was a little smaller. As a result, the thief's face was completely covered by Morrison's boot. As for his strength, there was no need to doubt. The thief let out a strange cry. His 2 rows of teeth had disappeared, and his nose had turned into a pile of mush. A series of blood bubbles of various sizes emerged from the terrifying hole in the middle of his nose. Morrison's university raised his leg again and kicked the thief in the chest. This time, the thief couldn't even cry out. His body slowly curled up. Morrison's university bent down, grabbed the thief's collar, and dragged him over. If it was in the past, the young magicians would have come over to watch. But now they were in groups, carefully observing the surrounding forest. Leger wiped the blood off his dagger and silently followed behind Morrison's. He didn't take the opportunity to mock Morrison's. There was no harm in joking, but he didn't want to hurt his friend's confidence. "This guy is quite fierce," Morrison's university said, embarrassed. Han Jin bent down to check. The thief was already unconscious. His whole face was badly mutilated, and he looked very miserable. Leger University came over and rummaged through the thief's body, hoping to find something that could provide clues. However, the thief had very few things on him. Other than a purse and a small box, there was nothing else. There were dozens of gold and silver coins in the purse, so he didn't seem to be a very rich thief. The small box contained a few bottles, which seemed to be some kind of potion. Han Jin University handed the bottles to Yelena. She took them and carefully observed them for a while, then shook her head. She couldn't recognize what kind of potion it was. Sasu University released the gushing spring spell and washed the blood off the thief's face. Although new blood immediately flowed out, at least the thief's eyebrows and eyes became clear. "I think I've seen this guy before," Sunir University suddenly said. Han Jin University was stunned. He looked over carefully and also felt that the thief looked familiar. That's right. Sunior University suddenly remembered. He was in the mercenary team we saw yesterday. His left eyebrow is shorter than his right. I was laughing at him yesterday. Yes, that's him. Yelena University nodded. I also noticed that his eyebrows were a little strange. It's not a good habit to make fun of other people's appearance, Hanjin University said softly. So, he has been following us since yesterday? Yelena University, does your magic detection have a fixed range? Yelena University was a little surprised. Obviously, she didn't understand why Hanjin University would ask such a common question. With my current magic power, I should be able to find magic sentries and traps within 50 meters. If a thief happens to approach me, I should be able to see his shadow. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.